From a distance, it had looked like a standard-issue bulk cruiser, old, slow, minimally armed, with very little going for it in a fight except its size. But as if so very much of warfare, appearances in this case turned out to be deceiving, and if Grand Admiral Thrawn hadn't been on the Chimera's bridge, Palayan had to admit that he might have been caught a bit by surprise. But Thrawn had been on the bridge, and had recognized immediately the unlikelihood that the rebellion strategists would have put such an important convoy under the protection of such a weak ship. And so when the bulk cruiser's base suddenly erupted with three full squadrons of A-Wing starfighters, the Chimera's TIE interceptors were already in space and swarming to the attack. Interesting tactic, Thrawn commented as the gap between the Chimera and the rebel convoy began to sparkle with laser flashes. If not especially innovative, the idea of converting bulk cruisers to starfighter carriers was first proposed over 20 years ago. I don't recall it ever being implemented, Palayan said, feeling a twinge of uneasiness as he eyed the tactical displays. A-Wings are faster even than those cursed X-Wings, and he wasn't at all sure how well his TIE interceptors would handle them. Excellent fighters, A-Wings, Thrawn said, as if reading Palayan's thoughts. Not without their limitations, though, particularly here. High-speed craft like that are far more suited to hit-and-fade operations than to escort duty. Forcing them to remain near a convoy largely neutralizes their speed advantage. He cocked a blue-black eyebrow at Palayan. Perhaps we're seeing the result of Admiral Akbar's removal as Supreme Commander. Perhaps. The TIE interceptors did indeed seem to be holding their own against the A-Wings, and the Chimera itself was certainly having no trouble. For the bulk cruiser, beyond the battlefront, the rest of the convoy was trying to huddle together as if that would do them any good. Akbar's people are still in charge, though. Obviously. We've been over this territory already, Captain, Thrawn said, his voice cooling slightly. Planting a vacuum-tight collection of evidence against Akbar would have ruined him far too quickly. The more subtle attack will still neutralize him, but it will also send ripples of uncertainty and confusion through the rebellion's entire political system. At the very least, it will distract and weaken them, just as the moment we will be launching the Mount Tantus campaign. At its best, it could split the entire alliance apart. He smiled. Akbar himself is replaceable, Captain. The delicate political balance the rebellion has created for itself is not. I understand all that, Admiral, Palayan growled. My concern is if your assumption that the boffin on the council can be relied upon to push things so close to your theoretical breakup point. Oh, he'll push all right, Thrawn said, his smile turning sardonic as he gazed out at the battle blazing on around the enemy convoy. I have spent many hours studying boffin art, Captain, and I understand the species quite well. There's no doubt at all that Councillor Failure will play his part beautifully. As beautifully as if we were pulling his strings directly. He tapped a key on his board. Starboard batteries. One of the frigates in the convoy is easing into attack position. Assume it's an armed backup and treat it accordingly. Squadrons A2 and A3 move to protect the flank until the frigate has been neutralized. The batteries and TIE wing commander acknowledged, and some of the turbo laser fire began to track on the frigate. And what happens if Failure wins? Palayan persisted. Quickly, I mean, before all this political confusion has a chance to set in. By our own analysis of the species, any boffin who's risen as high as Failure would have to be highly intelligent. Intelligent, yes, but not necessarily in any way that's dangerous to us, Thrawn said. He'd have to be a survivor, certainly, but that kind of verbal skill doesn't necessarily translate into military competence. He shrugged. Actually, a victory by Failure would merely prolong the whole awkward situation for the enemy. Given the kind of support Failure's been cultivating among the rebellion military, the politicians would have to go through another polarizing struggle when they realized their mistake and tried to replace him. Yes, sir, Palayan said, suppressing a sigh. It was the kind of tangled subtlety that he'd never really felt comfortable with. He just hoped the Grand Admiral was right about the potential gains. It would be a shame for intelligence to have engineered such a brilliantly successful bank job and then not get anything of real value out of it. Trust me, Captain, Thrawn said into his unspoken worries. I dare say the wasting of political effort has already begun, in fact. Akbar's staunchest allies would hardly have left Coruscant at this critical point unless they were desperately searching for evidence to clear him. Palayan frowned at him. Are you saying that Solo and Organa Solo are headed for the Palani system? Solo only, I think, Thrawn corrected thoughtfully. Organa Solo and the Wookiee are most likely still trying to find a place to hide from our Nograi, but Solo will be going to Palani, firmly convinced by intelligence's electronic sleight of hand that the trail leads through that system, which is why the Death's Head is on its way there right now. I see, Palayan murmured. He'd noticed that order on the daily log and had wondered why Thrawn was pulling one of their best Imperial Star Destroyers off battle duty. I hope it will be equal to the task. Solo and Skywalker have both proved hard to trap in the past. I don't believe Skywalker is going to Palani, Thrawn told him, his face settling into a somewhat sour expression. Our esteemed Jedi Master apparently called it correctly. Skywalker has decided to pay a visit to Jomark. Palayan stared at him. Are you sure, Admiral? I haven't seen anything from intelligence to that effect. The information wasn't from intelligence, Thrawn said. It came from Delta Source. Ah, Palaeon said, feeling his own expression go a little sour. The Chimera's intelligence section had been nagging him for months now to find out what exactly this Delta Source was that seemed to feed such clear and precise information to the Grand Admiral from the very heart of the Imperial Palace. So far all Thrawn would say was that Delta Source was firmly established and that the information gained through it should be treated as absolutely reliable. Intelligence hadn't even been able to figure out whether Delta Source was a person, a droid, or some exotic recording system that was somehow able to elude the rebellion's hourly counterintelligence sweeps of the palace. It irritated them no end, and Palaeon had to admit he didn't much like being kept in the dark about it either. But Thrawn had personally activated Delta Source, and long years of unwritten protocol in such matters gave him the right to keep the contact confidential if he chose. "I'm sure C'baoth will be pleased to hear it," he said. "I presume you'll want to give him the news yourself." He thought he'd hidden his irritation of C'baoth reasonably well. Apparently he'd thought wrong. He was still upset about Tarnab, Thrawn said, turning to gaze out at the battle. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, I am," Palaeon said stiffly. "I've been over the records again, and there's only one possible conclusion. C'baoth deliberately went beyond the battle plan Captain Aban had laid out, went beyond it to the point of disobeying a direct order. I don't care who C'baoth is or whether he felt justified or not, what he did constitutes mutiny." "It did indeed," Thrawn agreed calmly. "Shall I throw him out of the Imperial service altogether, or simply demote him in rank?" Palaeon glared at the other. "I'm serious, Admiral. So am I, Captain," Thrawn countered, his voice abruptly cold. "You know full well what's at stake here. We need to utilize every weapon at our disposal if we're to defeat the rebellion. C'baoth's ability to enhance coordination and battle efficiency between our forces is one of those weapons, and if he can't handle proper military discipline and protocol, then we bend the rules for him." "And what happens when we've bent the rules so far that they come around and stab us in the back?" Palaeon demanded. "He ignored a direct order at Tarnab. Maybe next time it'll be 2 orders, then 3, then 4, until finally he's doing what he damn well pleases and to blazes with the Empire. What's to stop him?" "Initially at the Asalamiri," Thrawn said, gesturing at the odd-looking tubular framework scattered around the bridge, each with an elongated furry creature wrapped around it, each of them creating a bubble in the Force where none of C'baoth's Jedi tricks would work. That's what they're here for, after all. "That's all well and good," Palaeon said. "But in the long run, I will stop him." Thrawn cut him off, touching his board. "Squadron C3, watch your port Zenith flank. There's a blister on that frigate that could be a cluster trap." The commander acknowledged, the TIE interceptors veering away in response. A second later, half a heartbeat too late, the blister abruptly exploded, sending a withering hail of concussion grenades outward in all directions. The rearmost of the TIE interceptors was caught by the edge of the fiery flower, shattering in a brilliant secondary explosion. The rest, out of range, escaped the booby trap unharmed. Thrawn turned his glowing eyes on Palaeon. "I understand your concerns, Captain," he said quietly. "What you failed to grasp, what you've always failed to grasp, is that a man of C'baoth's mental and emotional instabilities can never be a threat to us. Yes, he has a great deal of power, and at any given moment he could certainly do considerable damage to our people and equipment, but by his very nature he is unable to use that power for any length of time. Concentration, focus, long-term thinking, those are the qualities that separate a warrior from a mere flailing fighter, and they're qualities C'baoth will never possess." Palaeon nodded heavily. He still wasn't convinced, but there was clearly no use in arguing the point further. Not now, anyway. "Yes, sir," he hesitated. "C'baoth will also want to know about Organa Solo." Thrawn's eyes glittered, but the annoyance, Palaeon knew, wasn't directed at him. "You will tell Master C'baoth that I've decided to allow the Noghri one last chance to find and capture her. When we've finished here, I'll be taking that message to them. Personally." Palaeon glanced back at the entrance to the bridge, where the Noghri bodyguard Rourke stood in his usual silent vigil. "You're calling a convocate of the Noghri commandos?" he asked, suppressing a shiver. He'd been to one such mass meeting once, and facing a whole roomful of those quiet grey-skinned killers was not an experience he was anxious to repeat. "I think matters have gone beyond simply calling a convocate," Thrawn said coldly. "You'll instruct navigation to prepare a course from the rendezvous point to the Honogir system. The entire Noghri populace, I think, needs to be reminded of who it is they serve." He shifted his glare out to the viewport at the battle and tapped his board. "TIE Command, recall all fighters to the ship," he ordered. "Navigation, begin calculations for a return to the rendezvous point." Palaeon frowned out the viewpoint. The modified bulk cruiser and backup frigate were pretty much dead where they lay, but the convoy itself was largely undamaged. "We're letting them go? There's no need to destroy them," Thrawn said. "Stripping of them of their defense is an adequate object lesson for the moment." He tapped a key, and a tactical hollow of this section of the galaxy appeared between their two stations. Blue lines marked the rebellion's main trade routes. Those sheathed in red marked ones the Imperial forces had hit in the past month. There's more to these attacks than simple harassment, Captain. Once this group has told their story, all future convoys from Sarka will demand upgraded protection. Enough such attacks, and the rebellion will face the choice of either tying up large numbers of its ships with escort duty, or effectively abandoning cargo shipment through these border sectors. Either way, it will put them at a serious disadvantage when we launch the Mount Tantus campaign. He smiled grimly. Economics and psychology, Captain. For now, the more civilian survivors there are to spread the tale of Imperial power, the better. There will be time enough for destruction later. He glanced at his board, looked back out the viewport. Speaking of Imperial power, any news on our ship hunt? We've had 5 more capital ships turned into various Imperial bases in the past 10 hours, Paleon told him. Nothing larger than an old star galleon, but it's a start. We're going to need more than just a start, Captain, Thrawn said, craning his neck slightly to watch the returning TIE interceptors. Any word on Talon Card? Nothing since that tip from Rishi, Paleon told him, tapping the proper log for an update. The bounty hunter who sent it was killed shortly afterward. Keep up the pressure, Thrawn ordered. Card knows a great deal about what happens in this galaxy. If there are any capital ships lying unused out there, he'll know where they are. Personally, Paleon thought it pretty unlikely that a mere smuggler, even one with Card's connections, would have better information sources than the vast Imperial intelligence network, but he also dismissed the possibility that Card might be hiding Luke Skywalker out of that base on Mirka. Card was turning out to be full of surprises. There are a lot of people out there hunting for him, he told the Grand Admiral. Sooner or later, one of them will find him. Good, Thrawn glanced around the bridge. In the meantime, all units will continue their assigned harassment of the Abelium. His glowing red eyes bored into Paleon's face, and they will continue to maintain a watch for the Millennium Falcon and the Lady Luck. After the Noghri have been properly primed for their task, I want their prey to be ready for them. C'baoth awakened suddenly, his black-edged dreams giving way to the sudden realization that someone was approaching. For a moment he lay in there in the darkness, his long white beard scratching gently against his chest as he breathed, his mind reaching out through the Force to track along the road from the high castle to the cluster of villages at the base of the Rim Mountains. It was hard to concentrate, so very hard, but with a perverse grimness he ignored the fatigue-driven pain and kept at it. There. A lone man riding a Cratian thumper, labouring over one of the steeper sections of the roadway, most likely a messenger, come to bring him some news from the villagers below. Something trifling, no doubt, but something that they felt their new master should know. Master. The word echoed through C'baoth's mind, sparking a wind-blown tangle of thoughts and feelings. The Imperials, who pleaded for him to help them fight their battles, they called him Master too. So had the people of Wayland, whose lives he had been content to rule before Grand Admiral Thrawn and his promise of Jedi followers had lured him away. The people of Wayland had meant it. The people here on Jomark weren't quite sure yet whether they did or not. The Imperials didn't mean it at all. C'baoth felt his lip twist in disgust. No, they most certainly did not. They made him fight their battles for them, drove him by their disbelief to do things he hadn't attempted for years and years. And then, when he'd succeeded in doing the impossible, they still held tightly to their private contempt for him, hiding it behind those Ysalamiri creatures in the strange empty spaces they somehow created in the Force. But he knew. He'd seen the sideways looks among the officers and the brief but muttered discussions between them. He'd felt the edginess of the crew, submitting by imperial order to his influence on their combat skills but clearly disliking the very thought of it. And he'd watched Captain Aban sit there in his command chair on the bellicose, shouting and blaspheming at him even while calling him master, spitting anger and impotent rage, as C'baoth calmly inflicted his punishment on the rebel ship that had dared to strike at his ship. The messenger below was approaching the high castle gate now. Reaching out with the Force to call his rope to him, C'baoth got out of bed, feeling a brief rush of vertigo as he stood erect. Yes, it had been difficult, that business of taking command of the Bellicose's turbo-laser crews for the few seconds it had required to annihilate that rebel ship. It had gone beyond any previous stretch of concentration and control. The mental aches he was feeling now were the payment for that stretch. He tightened the rope sash around him, thinking back. Yes, it had been hard, and yet at the same time it had also been strangely exhilarating. On Wayland he had personally commanded a whole city-state, one with a larger population than that which nestled beneath the high castle. But there he'd long since gone beyond the need to impose his will by force. The humans and Sardans had submitted to his authority early on. Even the Maine-Shi, with their lingering resentment of his rule, had learned to obey his orders without question. The Imperials, as well as the people of Jomark, were going to have to learn that same lesson. Back when Grand Admiral Thrawn had first goaded C'baoth into this alliance, he'd implied that C'baoth had been too long without a real challenge. Perhaps the Grand Admiral had also secretly thought that this challenge of running the Empire's war would prove too much for a single Jedi Master to handle. Sabaev smiled tightly in the darkness. If that was what the glowing-eyed Admiral thought, he was going to be in for a surprise, because when Luke Skywalker finally got here, Sabaev would face perhaps the most subtle challenge of his life, to bend and twist enough a Jedi to his will without the other even being aware of what was happening to him. When he'd succeeded, there would be two of, and who could tell what be possible them then. The messenger had dismounted from his thumper and was standing beside the gate now, his sense that of a man prepared to await the convenience of his master, no matter how long that wait might be. That was good, exactly the proper attitude. Giving his robe sash one final tug, Sabaev headed through the maze of darkened rooms toward the door to hear what his new subjects wished to tell him. With a delicacy that always seemed so incongruous in a being his size, Chewbacca maneuvered the Falcon into his precisely selected orbital slot above the lush green moon of Endor. Rumbling under his breath, he switched over the power linkages and cut the engines back to standby. Seated in the co-pilot seat, Leia took a deep breath, wincing as one of the twins kicked her from inside. "Doesn't look like Carbarak's here yet," she commented, realizing even as she said it how superfluous the comment was. She'd been watching the sensors from the moment they dropped out of lightspeed, and given there were no other ships anywhere in the system, there wasn't much chance that they could have missed him. But with the familiar engine roar now cut back to a whisper, the silence felt strange and even a little eerie to her. Chewbacca growled a question. "We wait, I guess," Leia shrugged. "Actually, we're almost a day early. We got here faster than I'd expected." Chewbacca turned back to his board, growling his own interpretation of the Nogai's absence. "Oh, come on," Leia chided him. "If you decided to make this meeting into a trap, don't you think you'd have had a couple of Star Destroyers and an interdictor cruiser waiting to meet us?" "Your Highness," 3PO's voice called from down the tunnel, "I am sorry to disturb you, but I believe I've located the fault in the Carbanti countermeasures package. Could you ask Chewbacca to step back for a moment?" Leia raised her eyebrows in mild surprise as she looked at Chewbacca. As was depressingly normal with the Falcon, several bits of equipment had gone out early in the flight from Coruscant. Up to his elbows with more important repairs, Chewbacca had assigned the relatively low priority work on the Carbanti to 3PO. Leia had had no objections, for given the results the last time 3PO had tried to work on the Falcon, she hadn't expected very much to come of it. "We'll make a repair droid out of him yet," she said to Chewbacca. "Your influence, no doubt." The Wookiee snorted his opinion of that as he got out of the pilot seat and headed back to see what 3PO had found. The cockpit door slid open and closed again behind him, leaving the cockpit that much quieter. "See that planet down there, my dears?" Leia murmured, rubbing her belly gently. "That's Endor, where the Rebel Alliance finally triumphed over the Empire, and the New Republic began." Or at least, she amended silently to herself, that was what the history someday would say, that the death of the Empire occurred at Endor, for all the rest of it merely a mopping-up action. A mopping-up action which had lasted 5 years so far, and could wind up lasting another 20 the way things were going. She let her eyes drift across the brilliant mottled green world, turning slowly beneath them, wondering yet again why she'd chosen this place for a rendezvous of Carbarak. True, it was a system that practically every being in both the Republic and Imperial sections of the galaxy had heard of and knew how to find, and with the major planes of contention long gone from this sector, it was a quiet enough place for two ships to meet. But there were memories here too, some of which Leia would just as soon not bring to mind. Before they'd triumphed, they'd very nearly lost everything. From down the tunnel, Chewbacca roared a question. "Hang on, I'll check," Leia called back. Leaning over the board, she keyed a switch. "It reads standby/modulo, she reported. "Wait a minute. Now it reads system ready. Do you want me?" And abruptly, without any warning, a black curtain seemed to drop across her vision. Slowly she became aware that there was a metallic voice calling to her. "Your Highness," it said over and over again. "Your Highness, can you hear me? Please, Your Highness, can you hear me?" She opened her eyes, vaguely surprised to discover they were closed, to find Chewbacca leaning over her with an open medpack gripped in one huge hand, and agitated 3PO hovering like a nervous muffled bird behind him. "I'm all right," she managed. "What happened?" "You shouted for help," 3PO put in before Chewbacca could answer. "At least we thought it was for help," he amended helpfully. "You were brief and rather incoherent." "I don't doubt it," Leia told him. It was starting to come back now, like moonlight through the edge of a cloud. The menace, the rage, the hatred, the despair. "You didn't feel it, did you?" she asked Chewbacca. He growled a negative, watching her closely. "I felt nothing either," 3PO put in. Leia shook her head. "I don't know what it could have been. One minute I was sitting there, and then the next." She broke up a sudden horrible thought striking her. "Chewie, where does this orbit take us? Does it ever pass through the position where the Death Star blew up?" Chewbacca stared at her a moment, rumbling something deep in his throat. Then, shifting the medpack to his other hand, he reached past her to key the computer. The answer came almost immediately. 5 minutes ago, Leia murmured, feeling cold. That would be just about right, wouldn't it? Chewbacca growled an affirmative, then a question. I really don't know, she had to admit. It sounds a little like something Lake went through during his Jedi training, she amended, remembering just in time that Luke still wanted Dagobah's significance to be kept a secret, but he saw a vision. All I felt was, I don't know. It was anger and bitterness, but at the same time there was something almost sad about it. No, sad isn't the right word. She shook her head, sudden tears welling inexplicably up in her eyes. I don't know. Look, I'm all right. You two can go on back to what you were doing. Chewbacca rumbled under his breath again, clearly not convinced, but he said nothing else as he closed the medpack and pushed past 3PO. The cockpit door slid open for him, with the proverbial Wookiee disdain for subtlety, locked it in that position before disappearing down the tunnel into the main body of the ship. Leia focused on 3PO. You two, she told him. Go on, you still have work to do back there. I'm all right. Really. Well, very well, Your Highness, the droid said, clearly no happier than Chewbacca was. If you're certain. I am. Go on, scat. 3PO divvied around another moment, then obediently shuffled out of the cockpit. And the silence resumed, a silence that was thicker, somehow, than it had been before, and much darker. Leia set her teeth firmly together. I will not be intimidated, she said aloud to the silence. Not here, not anywhere. The silence didn't reply. After a minute, Leia reached over to the board and keyed in a course alteration that would keep them from again passing through the spot where the Emperor had died. Refusing to be intimidated, after all, didn't mean deliberately asking for trouble. And after that, there was nothing left to do but wait, and wonder if Carbaraka would indeed come. The topmost bit of the walled sea illic poked through the clutching trees of the jungle, pressing tightly around it, looking to Han for all the world like some sort of domed-topped, silver-skinned droid drowning in a sea of green quicksand. Any idea how we land on that thing? He asked. Probably through those vents near the top, Lando said, pointing at the Lady Luck's main display. They read large enough for anything up to about W-class space barge to get into. Han nodded, fingers plucking restlessly at the soft armrest of his co-pilot seat. There weren't a lot of things in the galaxy that could make him nervous, but having to sit there while someone else made a tricky landing was one of them. This is even a crazier place to live than that Nomad City thing of yours, he growled. No argument from me, Lando agreed, adjusting their altitude a bit. Several seconds later, then Han would have done it. At least on Klon, we don't have to worry about getting eaten by some exotic plant. But that's economics for you. At last count, there were 8 cities in this part of New Cov, and 2 more being built. Han grimaced, and all because of those same exotic plants, or to be specific, the exotic biomolecules that could be harvested from them. The Covies seemed to think that profit was worth having to live in armored cities all the time. No one knew what the plants thought about it. They're still crazy, he said. Watch out, they may have magnetic airlocks on those entrance ducts. Lando gave him a patient look. Will you relax? I have flown ships before, you know. Yeah, Han muttered. Setting his teeth together, he settled in to suffer through the landing. It wasn't as bad as he'd expected. Lando got his clearance from control and guided the Lady Luck with reasonable skill into the flaring maw of one of the entrance ducts, following the curved pipe down and inward to a brightly lit landing area just beneath the transparent steel dome that topped the city walls. Inbound customs were a mere formality, though given the planet's dependence on exports, the outbound scrutiny would probably be a lot tighter. They were officially welcomed to Illic by a professional greeter with a professional smile, given a data card with maps of the city and surrounding territory, and then turned loose. That wasn't so hard, Lando commented as they rode a sliding spiral ramp down through the spacious open center. At each level, walkways led outward from the ramp to the market, administrative and living areas of the city. Where are we supposed to be meeting Luke? 3 more levels down in one of the entertainment districts, Han told him. The Imperial Library didn't have much detail on this place, but it did mention a little tap cafe called the Mishra attached to some half-size version they've got of the old Grand Asman Theatre on Coruscant. I got the impression it was kind of a watering hole for local big shots. Sounds like a good place to meet, Lando agreed. He threw Han a sideways look. So, you ready to show me the hook yet? Han frowned. Hook? Come on, you old pirate, Lando snorted. You pick me up at Sluis Zahn, ask for a lift out to New Cov, and send Luke on ahead for this cloak and blade rendezvous, and you expect me to believe you're just going to wave goodbye now and let me go back to Nuklon? Han gave his friend his best wounded look. Come on, Lando. The hook, Han. Let me see the hook. Han sighed theatrically. There isn't any hook, Lando, he said. You can leave Nuklon any time you want to. Of course, he added casually, if you hung around a little and gave us a hand, you might be able to work a deal here to unload any spare metals you had lying around. Like, a stockpile of Freedium or something. Carefully keeping his eyes forward, he could still feel the heat of Lando's glare. Luke told you about that, didn't he? Lando demanded. Han shrugged. He might have mentioned it, he conceded. Lando hissed between clenched teeth. I'm going to strangle him, he announced. Jedi or not, I'm going to strangle him. Oh, come on, Lando, Han soothed. You hang around a couple days, you listen to people's jabberings, you maybe dig us out a lead or two about what Failure's got going here, and that's it. You go home and back to your mining operation, and we never bother you again. I've heard that before, Lando countered, but Han could hear the resignation in his voice. What makes you think Failure's got contacts on New Cov? Because during the war, this was the only place his boffins ever sane to care about defending. He broke off, grabbing Lando's arm and turning both of them hard to the right toward the central column of the spiral walkway. What? Lando managed. Quiet! Han hissed, trying to simultaneously hide his face and still watch the figure he'd spotted leaving the ramp on level down. That boffin down there to the left. See him? Lando turned slightly, peering in the indicated direction out of the corner of his eye. What about him? It's Tav Brailiar, one of Failure's top aides. You're kidding, Lando said, frowning down at the alien. How can you tell? That neckpiece he wears. Some kind of family crest or something. I've seen it dozens of times at council meetings. Han chewed at his lip, trying to think. If that really was Brailiar over there, finding out what he was up to could save them a lot of time. But Luke was probably sitting in the tap cafe downstairs right now waiting for them. I'm going to follow him, he told Lando, shoving his data pad and the city map into the other's hands. You head down to the Mishra, grab Luke, and catch up with me. But if you're not with me in an hour, I'll try calling on the comlink. Han cut him off, stepping toward the outside of the ramp. They were nearly to the boffin's level now. Don't call me. I might be someplace I wouldn't want a call beep going off. He stepped off the ramp onto the walkway. Good luck, Lando called softly after him. There was a good scattering of aliens among the humans wandering around Dillik, but Brailiar's cream-coloured fur stood out of the crowd enough to make him easy to follow, which is just as well. If Han could recognize the boffin could probably recognize him right back, and it would be risky to have to get too close. Luckily, the alien didn't seem to even consider the possibility that anyone might be following him. He kept up at a steady pace, never turning around. As he headed past cross streets and shops and atria toward the outer city wall, Han stayed with him, wishing he hadn't been so quick to give the city map to Lando. It might have been nice to have some idea where he was going. They passed through one final atrium and reached a section of warehouse-type structures abutting a vast mural that seemed to have been painted directly on the inner city wall. Brailiar went straight to one of the buildings near the mural and disappeared through the front door. Han ducked into a convenient doorway about 30 meters down the street from the warehouse. The door Brailiar had gone through, he could see, carried the faded sign Amethyst Shipping and Storage above it. I just hope it's on the map, he muttered under his breath, pulling his comlink from his belt. It is, a woman's voice came softly from behind him. Han froze. Hello? He asked tentatively. Hello, she said back. Turn around, please. Slowly, of course. Han did as ordered, the comlink still in hand. If this is a robbery, don't be silly. The woman was short and slender, perhaps 10 years older than him, with close-cut greying hair and a thin face which under other circumstances would look friendly enough. The blaster pointed his direction with some unfamiliar knockoff of a Blastech DL-18, not nearly as powerful as his own DL-44, but under the circumstances the difference didn't matter a whole lot. Put the comlink on the ground, she continued. You're blasted too, as long as you're down there. Silently, Han crouched down, drawing his weapon out with exaggerated caution. Under cover of the motion, with most of her attention hopefully on the blaster, he flicked on the comlink. Laying both on the ground, he straightened and took a step back, just to prove that he knew the proper procedure for prisoners. Now what? You seem interested in the little get-together yonder, she said, stooping to retrieve the blaster and comlink. Perhaps you'd like a guided tour. That would be great, Han told her, raising his hands and hoping that she wouldn't think to look at the comlink before putting it away in one of the pockets in her jumpsuit. She didn't look at it. She did, however, shut it off. I think I'm insulted, she said mildly. That has to be the oldest trick on the list. Han shrugged, determined to maintain at least a little dignity here. I didn't have time to come up with any new ones. Apology accepted. Come on, let's go. Lower your hands. We don't want any passerby wandering down, do we? Of course not, Han said, dropping his hands to his sides. They were halfway to the Amethyst when, off in the distance, a siren began wailing. It was, Luke thought as he looked around the Mishra, almost like an inverted replaying of his first visit to the Mos Eisley Cantina on Tatooine all those years ago. True, the Mishra was light years more sophisticated than that dilapidated place had been, with a correspondingly more upscale clientele, but the bar and tables were crowded with the same wide assortment of humans and aliens. The smells and sounds were equally variegated, and the band off in the corner was playing similar music, a style obviously that had been carefully tailored to appeal to a multitude of different races. There was one other difference, too. Crowded through the place might be, the patrons were leaving Luke a respectful amount of room at the bar. He took a sip of his drink, a local variant of the hot chocolate Lando had introduced him to, this one with a touch of mint, and glanced over at the entrance. Han and Lando should have been only a couple of hours behind him, which meant they could be walking in at any minute. He hoped so anyway. He'd understood Han's reasons for wanting the two ships to come into Illic separately, but with all the threats that seemed to be hanging over the New Republic, they couldn't really afford to waste time. He took another sip, and from behind him came an inhuman bellow. He spun around, hand-automatically yanking his lightsaber from his belt, as the sound of a chair crashing over backwards added an exclamation point to the bellow. 5 meters from him, in the middle of a circle of frozen patrons, a Barrable and a Radian stood facing each other over a table, both with blasters drawn. "No blasters! No blasters!" an SE-4 servant droid called, waving his arms for emphasis as he scuttled toward the confrontation. In the flick of an eye, the Barrable shifted aim and blew the droid apart, bringing his blaster back to bear on the Radian before the other could react. "Hey!" the bartender said indignantly. "That's going to cost you." "Shut up!" the Barrable cut him off with a snarl. "Radian will pay you, after he pay me." The Radian drew himself up to his full height, which still left him a good half-meter short of his opponent, and spat something in a language Luke didn't understand. "You lie," the Barrable spat back. "You cheat. I know." The Radian said something else. "You know like," the Barrable countered, his voice haughty. "You do anyway. I call on Jedi for judgment." Every eye in the Tap Cafe had been riveted to the confrontation. Now in almost perfect unison, the gazes turned to Luke. "What?" he asked cautiously. "He wants you to settle the dispute," the bartender said, relief evident in his voice, a relief that Luke himself was far from feeling. "Me?" The bartender gave him a strange look. "You're the Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker, aren't you?" he asked, gesturing at the lightsaber in Luke's hand. "Yes," Luke admitted. "Well then," the bartender concluded, waving a hand toward the disputants. Except that Jedi or no Jedi, Luke didn't have a drop of legal authority here. He opened his mouth to tell the bartender that, then took another look into the other's eyes. Slowly he turned back around, the excuses sticking unsaid in his throat. It wasn't just the bartender he saw. Everyone in the Tap Cafe, it seemed, was looking at him with pretty much the same expression, an expression of expectation and trust. Trust in the judgment of a Jedi. Taking a quiet breath, sternly ordering his pounding heart to calm down, he started through the crowd toward the confrontation. Ben Kenobi had introduced him to the Force. Yoda had taught him how to use the Force for self-control and self-defense. Neither had ever taught him anything about mediating arguments. "All right," he said as he reached the table. "First thing you're going to do, both of you, is put away your weapons." "Who first?" the Barrable demanded. "Radians collect bounty. He shoot if I disarm." This was certainly getting off to a great start. Suppressing a sigh, Luke ignited his lightsaber, holding it out so that the brilliant green blade was directly between the opposing blasters. "No one is going to shoot anyone," he said flatly. "Put them away." Silently, the Barrable complied. Radian hesitated a second longer, then followed suit. "Now tell me the problem," Luke said, shutting down the lightsaber but keeping it ready in his hand. "He hired me for tracking job," the Barrable said, jabbing a keratin-plated finger at the Radian. "I do what he say, but he no pay me." The Radian said something indignant sounding. "Just a minute, I'll get to you," Luke told him, wondering how he was going to handle that part of the cross-examination. "What sort of job was it?" "He asked me hunt animal nest for him," the Barrable said. "Animals bothering little ships, eating its sides. I do what he say. He burn animal nest, get money. But then he pay me in no good money." He gestured down at a now scattered pile of gold-coloured metal chips. Luke picked one up. It was small and triangular with an intricate pattern of lines in the centre, and inscribed with a small 100 in each corner. "Anyone ever seen this currency before?" he called, holding it up. "It's new Imperial script," someone dressed in an expensive business coat said with thinly veiled contempt. "You can only spend it on Imperial-held worlds and stations." Luke grimaced. Another reminder, if he'd needed one, that the war for control of the galaxy was far from over. "Did you tell him beforehand you'd be paying him this?" he asked the Radian. The other said something in his own language. Luke glanced around the circle, wondering if asking for a translator would diminish his perceived status here. "He said that was how he was paid," a familiar voice said. And Luke turned to see Lando ease his way to the front of the crowd. "Says he argued about it, but they didn't have any choice in the matter." "That is how the Empire's been doing business lately," someone in the crowd offered. "At least around here." The Barrable spun toward the other. "I don't want your judgment," he snarled. "Only Jedi gave judgment." "All right, calm down," Luke told him, fingering the chip and wondering what he was going to do. If this really was the way the Radian had been paid, "Is there any way to convert these into something else?" he asked the Radian. The other answered. "He says no," Lando translated. "You can use them for goods and services on Imperial worlds, but since no one in the New Republic will take them, there's no official rate of exchange." "Right," Luke said dryly. He might not have Lando's experience in under-the-plate operations, but he hadn't been born yesterday either. So what's the unofficial exchange rate? No idea, actually, Lando said, looking around the crowd. Must be someone here who works both sides of the street, though. He raised his voice. Anyone here do business with the Empire? If they did, they were keeping quiet about it. Shy, aren't they? Luke murmured. About admitting Imperial dealings to a Jedi? Lando countered. I'd be shy too. Luke nodded, feeling a sinking sense in the pit of his stomach as he studied the Radiant's tapir-like snout, passive, multifaceted eyes. He'd hoped that he could simply smooth out the problem and thereby avoid the need to pass any kind of real judgment. Now he had no choice but to rule on whether the Radiant was in fact deliberately trying to cheat his partner. Closing his eyes down to slits, he composed his mind and stretched out his senses. It was a long shot, he knew, but most species showed subtle physiological changes when under stress. If the Radiant was lying about the payment, and if he thought that Luke's Jedi skills could catch him at it, he might react enough to incriminate himself. But even as Luke ran through the sensory enhancement techniques, something else caught his attention. It was an odor, a faint whiff of Karababa, Tabak, and Mudu, the same combination Lando had called his attention to on the Sluis Van space station. Luke opened his eyes and looked around the crowd. Niles Ferrier, he called. Will you step forward, please? There was a long pause, punctuated only by Lando's sudden hissing intake of air at Ferrier's name. Then, with a rustle of movement from one side of the circle, a familiar bulky figure pushed his way to the front. What do you want? He demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered blaster. I need to know the unofficial exchange rate between Imperial and New Republic currencies, Luke said. I thought perhaps you could tell me what it is. Ferrier studied him with ill-concealed scorn. This is your problem, Jedi. Leave me out of it. There was a low rumble of displeasure from the crowd. Luke didn't reply, but held Ferrier in a level gaze, and after a moment the other's lip twisted. The last time I did business on the other side, we settled on a 5-4 Empire/Republic conversion, he growled. Thank you, Luke said. That seems straightforward enough then, he continued, turning to the Radiant. Pay your associate with New Republic currency at a 5/4 exchange rate. Take the Empire script back for the next time you work in their territory. The Radiant spat something. That is lie, the Barabel snarled back. Says he doesn't have enough in New Republic currency, Lando translated. Knowing Radiant, I'd tend to agree with the Barabel. Perhaps. Luke stared hard into the Radiant's faceted eyes. Perhaps not, but there might be another way. He looked back at Ferrier, raised his eyebrows questioningly. The other was sharp, all right. Don't even think it, Jedi, he warned. Why not? Luke asked. You work both sides of the border. You're likely to be able to spend Imperial script than the Barabel could. Suppose I don't want to, Ferrier countered. Suppose I don't plan to go back anytime soon. Maybe I don't want to get caught with that much Imperial script on me. Fix it yourself, Jedi. I don't owe you any favors. The Barabel whirled on him. You talk respect, he snarled. He is Jedi. You talk respect. A low rumble of agreement rippled through the crowd. Better listen to him, Lando advised. I don't think you'd want to get in a fight here, especially not with a Barabel. I've always had a soft spot for Jedi. Yeah, right behind their snouts, Ferrier retorted, but his eyes were flicking around the crowd now, and Luke caught the subtle shift in his sense as he began to realize just how much in the minority his opinion of Luke was. Perhaps he was realizing that winding up in the middle of an official flap might buy him more attention than he really wanted to have. Luke waited, watching the other sense flicker with uncertainty, waiting for him to change his mind. When it happened quickly. All right, but it'll have to be a 5-3 exchange, Ferrier insisted. The 5-4 was a fluke. No telling if I'll ever get that again. It is cheat, the Barabel declared. I deserve more from Radiant. Yes, you do, Luke agreed, but under the circumstances this is probably the best you're going to get. He looked at the Radiant. If it helps any, he added to the Barabel, remember you can pass a warning to the rest of your people about dealing with this particular Radiant. Not being able to hire expert Barabel hunters will hurt him far more in the long run than he might cost you now. The Barabel made a grating noise that was probably the equivalent of a laugh. Jedi speak truth, he said. Punishment is good. Luke braced himself. This part the Barabel wasn't going to be nearly as so happy about. You will, however, have to pay for the repair of the droid you shot. Whatever the Radiant said or did, he is not responsible for that. The Barabel stared at Luke, his needle teeth making small, tight-biting motions. Luke returned the cold gaze, senses alert to the Force for any intimation of attack. Jedi again speak truth, the alien said at last, reluctantly but firmly. I accept your judgment. Luke let out a quiet sigh of relief. Then the matter is closed, he said. He looked at Ferrier, then raised his lightsaber to his forehead in salute to the two aliens and turned away. Nicely done, Lando murmured in his ear as the crowd began to break up. Thanks, Luke murmured, his mouth dry. It had worked all right, but it had been more luck than skill, and he knew it. If Ferrier hadn't been there, or if the ship thief hadn't decided to back down, Luke had no idea how he would have solved the dispute. Leia and her diplomatic training would have done better than he had. Even Han and his long experience at hard bargaining would have done as well. It was an aspect of Jedi responsibility that he'd never considered before, but it was one he'd better start thinking about, and fast. Han's following one of Thalio's Boffin pals up on level 4, Lando was saying as they moved through the crowd toward the exit. Spotted him from the west central ramp and sent me to... He stopped short. From outside the Mishra, the sound of wailing sirens had started. "I wonder what that is," he said, a touch of uneasiness in his voice. "It's an alarm," one of the Tap Cafe patrons said. His forehead wrinkled in concentration as he listened. The pitch of the siren changed again. "It's a raid." "A raid?" Luke frowned. He hadn't heard of any pirate activity in this sector. "Who's raiding you?" "Who else?" the man retorted. "The Empire." Luke looked at Lando. "Uh-oh," he said quietly. "Yeah," Lando agreed. "Come on." They left the Mishra and headed out into the wide avenue. Oddly enough, there were no signs of the panic Luke would have expected to find. On the contrary, the citizens of Illic seemed to be continuing about their daily business as if nothing untoward was happening. "Maybe they don't realize what's going on," he suggested doubtfully as they headed for one of the spiral ramps. "Or else they've got a quiet agreement with the Empire," Lando countered sourly. "Maybe the leadership finds it politically handy to align themselves with the New Republic, but they also want to keep in the Empire's good graces. Since they can't pay anything as overt as tribute, they instead let the Imperials come in every so often and raid their stocks of refined biomolecules. I've seen that sort of thing done before." Luke looked around at the unconcerned crowds, and this time it might backfire on them. "Like if the Imperials spot the Lady Luck in your X-Wing in the landing records." "Right. Where did you say Han was?" "Last I saw, he was on level 4 heading west," Lando said, digging out his comlink. "He told me not to call him, but I think this qualifies as an unforeseen circumstance." "Wait a minute," Luke stopped him. "If he's anywhere near this aid of Thalia's, and if Thalia is working some kind of deal with the Empire..." "You're right," Lando swore under his breath as he put the comlink away. "So what do we do?" They'd reached the ramp now and stepped onto the section spiraling upward. "I'll go find Han," Luke said. "You get up to the landing area and see what's happening. If the Imperials haven't actually landed yet, you might be able to get into the air control computer and erase us from the list. R2 can help if you can get him out of my X-Wing and over to a terminal without being caught. I'll give it a try." "Okay." A stream of memory flicked through Luke's mind. "I don't suppose the Lady Luck's equipped with one of those full-rig slave circuits you talked about back on Klon, is it?" Lando shook his head. "It's rigged, but only for a simple homing setup. Nothing much more than the straight-line motion and a little maneuvering. It'd never be able to get to me through the middle of an enclosed city like this. And even if it could, Luke had to admit it wouldn't do them much good. Short of blasting a huge hole through the outer wall, the only way out of Illic for anything the size of a spaceship was through the exit ducts above the landing area. It was just a thought," he said. "Here's where Han got off," Lando said, pointing. "He headed that way." "Right." Luke stepped off the ramp. "See you soon. Be careful. You too." The greying woman took Han to a small office-type room in the Amethyst building, turned him over to a couple of other guard types there, and disappeared with his blaster, comlink, and ID in hand. Han tried to once or twice to strike up a conversation with the guards, got no response from either of them, and had just about resigned himself to sitting quietly, listening to the sirens outside, when the woman returned, accompanied by another, taller woman with the unmistakable air of authority about her. "Good day to you," the tall woman said, nodding at Han. "Captain Han Solo, I believe." With his ID in her hand, there didn't seem much point in denying it. "That's right," he said. "We're honoured by your visit," she said, her tone putting a slightly sardonic edge to the polite words, though a bit surprised by it. "I don't know why. The visit was your idea," Han countered. "You always pick people up off the street like this." "Slightly." "You want to tell me who you are and who sent you?" Han frowned. "What do you mean, who am I? You've got my ID right there." "Yes, I do," the woman nodded, turning the card over in her hand. "But there's some difference of opinion as to whether or not it's genuine." She looked out the door and beckoned, and Tav Brayliar stepped past her into the room. "I was right," the Boffin said, his cream-coloured fur rippling in an unfamiliar pattern. "As I told you when I first saw his ID, he's an imposter, most certainly an Imperial spy." "What?" Han stared at him, the whole situation tilting slightly off vertical. He looked at the alien's neckpiece. It was Tav Brayliar, all right. "What did you call me?" "You're an Imperial spy," Brayliar repeated, his fur rippling again. "Come to destroy our friendship, or even to kill us all. But you'll never live to report back to your masters." He turned to the tall woman. "You must destroy him at once, Sena," he urged, "before he has the chance to summon your enemies here." "Let's not do anything rash, Council Aide Brayliar," Sena soothed. "Arinez has a good picket screen in position." She looked at Han. "Would you care to respond to the Council Aide's accusations?" "We have no interest in the ravings of an Imperial spy," Brayliar insisted before Han could speak. "On the contrary, Council Aide," Sena countered. "Around here we have an interest in a great many things." She turned back to Han, lifted his ID. Do you have any proof other than this that you're who you claim to be? It doesn't matter who he is. Brayley jumped in again, his voice starting to sound a little strained. He's seen you and he must certainly know that we have some kind of arrangement. Whether he's from the Empire or the New Republic is irrelevant. Both are your enemies, and both would use such information against you. Sena's eyebrows lifted again. So now his identity doesn't matter, she said coolly. Does that mean you're no longer certain he's an imposter? Brayley's fur rippled again. Clearly he wasn't as quick or on his verbal feet as his boss. He's a very close likeness, the other muttered, though a proper dissection would quickly establish for certain who he is. Sana smiled slightly, but it was a smile of understanding, not of humour, and suddenly Han realised that the confrontation had been as much a test of Brayley as it had been of him. As if Sana's expression was anything to go by, the boffin had just flunked it. I'll keep that recommendation in mind, she told him dryly. There was a soft beep, and the grey-haired woman pulled out a comlink and spoke quietly into it. She listened, spoke again, and looked up at Sana. Picket line reports another man approaching, she said. Medium build, dark blonde hair, dressed in black. She threw a glance at Brayley, and carrying what appears to be a lightsaber. Sana looked at Brayley too. I believe that ends the discussion, she said. Have one of the pickets meet him, Irens, and ask him if he'll join us. Make it clear that's a request, not an order. Then return Captain Solo's weapon and equipment to him. She turned to Han, nodded gratefully to him as she returned his ID. My apologies, Captain. You understand we have to be cautious, particularly given the coincidence of this. She gestured toward the outside wall. Han frowned, wondering what she meant. Then he got it. She was indicating the sirens still wailing outside. No problem, he assured her. What are the sirens for anyway? It's an Imperial raid, Irenez said, handing him his blaster and comlink. Han froze. A raid? It's no big deal, Sana assured him. They come by every few months and take a percentage of the refined biomolecules that have been packaged for export. It's a covert form of taxation the city governments have worked out with them. Don't worry, they never come any farther than from the landing level. Yeah, well, they may change the routine a little this time, Han growled, flicking on his comlink. He half expected someone to try to stop him, but no one even twitched. Luke? I'm here, Han, the younger man's voice came back. My escort tells me I'm being brought to where you are. You all right? Just a little misunderstanding. Better get in here fast. We got company. Right. Han shut off the comlink. Sana and Aranez, he saw, had meanwhile been having a quiet conversation of their own. If you're as touchy about Imperials as Brayley implied, you might want to find a hole to disappear into, he advised. Our escape route's ready, Sana assured him as Aranez left the room. The question is what to do with you and your friend. You can't just firm them loose, Brayley insisted, trying one last time. You know full well that if the New Republic learns about you, the commander is being notified, Sana cut him off. He decide. But that's all, Council Aide. She cut him off again, her voice suddenly hard. Join the others at the lift shaft. You'll accompany me on my ship. Brayley threw one last unreadable look at Han, then silently left the room. Who's this commander of yours? Han asked. I can't tell you that. Sana studied him a moment. Don't worry, though. Despite what Brayley said, we're not enemies of the New Republic. At least not at the moment. Oh, Han said. Great. There was a sound of footsteps from the hallway outside. A few seconds later, accompanied by two young men with holstered blasters, Luke stepped into the room. Han, Luke greeted his friend, giving Sana a quick once-over. You're all right? I'm fine, Han assured him. Like I said, a little misunderstanding. The lady here, Sana, he paused expectantly. Let's just leave it at Sana for now, she said. Ah, Han said. He'd hoped to get her last name, but clearly she wasn't in the habit of giving it out. Anyway, Sana thought I was an Imperial spy. And speaking of Imperials, I know, Luke nodded. Lando's gone up to see if he can clear our ships from the landing record. He won't be able to, Han shook his head. Not in time, and they're bound to pull the landing list. Luke nodded agreement. Then we'd better get up there. Unless you'd all rather come with us, Sana offered. There's plenty of room on our ship, and it's hidden away where they won't find it. Thanks, but no, Han said. He wasn't about to go after these people until he knew a lot more about them. Whose side they were on, for starters. Lando won't want to leave his ship. And I need to get my droid back, Luke added. Ironez slipped back into the room. Everyone's on their way down, and the ship's being prepped, she told Sana. And I got through to the commander. She handed the tall woman a data pad. Sana glanced at it, nodded, and turned back to Han. There's a service shaft near here that opens up into the west edge of the landing area, she told him. I doubt the Imperials know about it. It's not on any of the standard city maps. Ironez will guide you up there and give you what help she can. That's really not necessary, Han told her. Sana held up the datapad. The commander has instructed me to give you whatever aid you require, she said firmly. I'd appreciate it if you'd allow me to carry out my orders. Han looked at Luke, raised his eyebrows. Luke shrugged slightly in return. If there was treachery in the offer, his Jedi senses weren't picking it up. Fine, she can tag along, he said. Let's go. Good luck, Sana said, and disappeared out the door. Ironez gestured to the door after her. This way, gentlemen. The service shaft was a combination stairway and lift car tube set into the outer city wall, its entrance almost invisible against the swirling pattern of that section of the mural. The lift car itself was nowhere to be seen. Probably, Han decided, still ferrying Sana's group to wherever it was they'd stashed their ship. With Ironez in the lead, they started up the stairs. It was only 3 levels up to the landing area, but 3 levels in a city with Illich's high-ceilinged layout translated into a lot of stairs. The first level ran to 53 steps. After that, Han stopped counting. By the time they'd slipped through another disguised door into the landing area and took cover behind a massive diagnostic analyzer, his legs were beginning to tremble with fatigue. Ironez, in contrast, wasn't even breathing hard. "Now what?" Luke asked, looking cautiously around the analyzer. He hasn't breathing hard, either. "Let's find Lando," Han said, pulling out his comlink and thumbing his call. "Lando? Right here," the other's whispered voice came back instantly. "Where are you?" "West end of the landing area, about 20 meters from Luke's X-Wing." "How about you?" "About 90 degrees away from you toward the south," Lando answered. "I'm behind a stack of shipping boxes. There's a stormtrooper standing guard about 5 meters away, so I'm sort of stuck here." "What sort of trouble are we looking at?" "Looks like a full-fledged task force," Lando said grimly. "I saw 3 dropships come in, and I think there were 1 or 2 on the ground when I got here. If they were fully loaded, that translates to 160 to 200 men. Most of them are regular army troops, but there are a few stormtroopers in the crowd too. There aren't too many of either still up here. Most of them headed on down to the ramps a few minutes ago. Probably gone to search the city for us," Luke murmured. "Yeah." Han eased up to look over the analyzer. The top of Luke's X-Wing was just visible over the nose of a W-23 space barge. "Looks like R2's still in Luke's ship." "Yeah, but I saw them doing something over that way," Lando warned. "They may have put a restraining bolt on him." "We can handle that." Han scanned as much of the area around them as he could see. "I think we can make it to the X-Wing without being spotted. You told me on the trip here that you had a beckon call for the Lady Luck, right?" "Right, but it's not going to do me any good," Lando said. "Pull these boxes around. There's no place I can set it down without opening myself to fire." "That's okay," Han told him, feeling a tight smile twisting at his lip. Luke might have the Force, and Aranez might be able to climb stairs without getting winded, but he would bet heavily that he could outdo both of them in sheer chicanery. "You just get it moving toward you when I give the word." He switched off the comlink. "We're going over to the X-Wing," he told Luke and Aranez, adjusting his grip on his blaster. "You ready?" He got 2 acknowledgements, and with a last look around the area, headed as quickly as silence permitted across the floor. He reached the space barge lying across their path without incident, paused there to let the others catch up. "Shh!" Luke hissed. Han froze, pressing himself against the barge's corroded hull. Not 4 meters away, a stormtrooper standing guard was starting to turn in their direction. Clenching his teeth, Han raised his blaster, but even as he did so, his peripheral vision caught Luke's hand making some sort of gesture, and suddenly the Imperial spun around in the opposite direction, pointing his blaster rifle toward a patch of empty floor. "He thinks he heard a noise," Luke whispered. "Let's go." Han nodded, and sidled around to the other side of the barge. A few seconds later, they were crouched behind the X-Wing's landing skids. "R2?" Han's Stage whispered upward. "Come on, short stuff, wake up." There was a soft and rather indignant beep from the top of the X-Wing, which meant the Imperial's restraining bolt hadn't shut the droid down entirely, just blocked out his control of the X-Wing systems. "Good. Okay," he called to the droid. "Get your comm sensor warmed up and get ready to record." Another beep. "Now what?" Ironez asked. "Now we get cute," Han told her, pulling out his comlink. "Lando, you ready?" "As ready as I'm going to be," the other came back. "Okay, when I give the signal, turn your beck and call and get the Lady Luck moving. When I tell you again, shut it off. Got that?" "Got it. I hope you know what you're doing." "Trust me." Han looked at Luke. "You got your part figured out?" Luke nodded, holding up his lightsaber. "I'm ready." "Okay, Lando. Go." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then through the background noise of the landing area came the distinctive whine of repulsor lifts being activated. Half standing up, Han was just in time to see the Lady Luck rise smoothly up from among the other docked ships. From somewhere in the same general vicinity came a shout, followed by the multiple flash of blaster fire. Another 3 weapons opened up almost immediately, all 4 tracking the Lady Luck as it made a somewhat ponderous turn and began floating south toward Lando's hiding place. "You know it'll never get there," Ironez muttered in Han's ear. "As soon as they figure out where it's going, they'll be all over him. That's why it's not going to get to him," Han countered, watching the Lady Luck closely. Another couple of seconds, and every stormtrooper and Imperial soldier in the place ought to have his attention solidly fixed on the rogue ship. "Ready, Luke? Now." And suddenly Luke was gone, a single leap taking him to the top of the X-Wing. Over the commotion, Han heard the snap hiss as Luke ignited his lightsaber, could see the green glow reflected from the nearest ships and equipment. The glow and sound shifted subtly as Luke made a short slice. "Restraining bolts off," Luke called down. "Now?" "Not yet," Han told him. The Lady Luck was about a quarter of the way to the far wall, blaster bolts still scattering off its armored underside. "I'll tell him when." You get ready to fly interference. Right. The X-Wing rocked slightly as Luke moved forward and dropped into the cockpit, its own repulsor lifts beginning to whine as R2 activated them. A whine that no one else out in all that confusion had a hope of hearing. The Lady Luck was halfway to the wall now. Okay, Lando, shut down, Han ordered. R2, your turn. Call it back this way. With full access to the X-Wing's transmitters, it was a simple task for the droid to duplicate the signal from Lando's beckon call. The Lady Luck shuddered to a halt, reoriented itself to the new call, and started across the landing area, again toward the X-Wing. It wasn't something the Imperials had expected. For a second the blaster fire faltered as the soldiers chasing the yachts skidded to a halt. By the time the fire resumed in earnest, for Lady Luck was nearly to the X-Wing. Now? Luke called. Now, Han called back. Put her down and clear us a path. R2 tweeted and the Lady Luck again halted in midair, this time dropping smoothly to the ground. There was a shout that sounded like triumph from the Imperials, but if so, it was the shortest triumph on record. The Lady Luck touched down, and without warning, the X-Wing leapt into the air. Pulling a tight curve around the Lady Luck, Luke swooped back down, wingtip lasers spitting a corridor of destruction across the startled soldiers' line of approach. Given time, the Imperials would regroup. Han had no intention of giving them that time. Come on, he snapped to Ironez, leaping to his feet and making a mad dash for the Lady Luck. He was probably on the ramp before the soldiers even noticed him, and was up and through the hatch before anyone was able to get off a shot. Stay here and guard the hatch, he shouted back as Ironez charged in behind him. I'm going to go pick up Lando. Luke was still roaring around, creating havoc, so Han scrambled into the cockpit and dived into the pilot's seat, throwing a quick look at the instruments as he did so. All the systems seemed to be ready, and anything that wasn't going to have to do so on the way up. Grab onto something, he shouted back to Ironez and lifted. The stormtrooper Lando had mentioned as being near his position was nowhere in sight as Han brought the Lady Luck swinging over to the pile of shipping boxes. Luke was right with him, the X-Wing's lasers making a mess of the landing area floor as he kept the Imperials pinned down. Han dropped the ship to within a half-meter of the floor, entrance ramp swiveled toward the boxes. There was a flicker of motion, visible for just a second through the cockpit side viewport. We've got him, Ironez shouted from the hatch. Go! Han swiveled the ship around, throwing full power to the repulsor lifts and heading upward into one of the huge exit ducts overhead. There was a slight jolt as he cleared the magnetic seal on the end, and then they were out in the clear air, screaming hard for space. 4 TIE fighters were skulking around just above the city, waiting for trouble, but they apparently weren't waiting for it to come this quickly. Luke got 3 of them on the fly, and Han took out the 4th. Nothing like cutting it close to the wire, Lando panted as he slid into the co-pilot seat and got busy with his board. What have we got? Looks like a couple more dropships coming in, Han told him, frowning. What are you doing? Running a multi-sensor airflow analysis, Lando said. It'll show up any large irregularities on the hull, like if someone's attached a homing beacon to us. Han fell back to that escape from the first Death Star, and their near-disastrous flight to Yavin with just such a gadget smuggled aboard. I wish I had a system like that for the Falcon. It'd never work, Lando commented dryly. Your hull's so irregular already, the system would go nuts just trying to map it. He keyed off the display. Okay, we're clear. Great. Han threw a glance out to the left. We're clear of those dropships too. They don't have a hope of catching us now. Yes, but that might, Ironez said, pointing at the mid-range scope, which showed an Imperial Star Destroyer behind them, already leaving orbit and moving into pursuit. Great, Han growled, kicking them in the main drive. Using it this close to the ground wasn't going to do New Cov's plant life any good, but that was the least of his worries at the moment. Luke? I see it. Luke's voice came back through the comm speaker. Any ideas besides running for it? I think running for it sounds like a great idea, Han said. Lando? Calculating the jump now, the other said, busy with the nav computer. It ought to be ready by the time we're far enough out. There's another ship coming up from below, Luke said. Right out of the jungle. That's ours, Ironez said, peering over Han's shoulder. You can parallel them by changing course to 126 Mark 30. The Star Destroyer was picking up speed, the scope now showing a wedge of TIE fighters sweeping along ahead of it. We'd do better to split up, Han said. No, stay with our ship, Ironez said. Sana said we've got help coming. Han took another look at the ship climbing for deep. A small transport, with a fair look of speed but not much else going for it. Another look at the approaching TIE fighters. They're going to be in range before we can make the jump, Lando murmured, echoing Han's thought. Yeah. Luke, you still there? Yes, I think Lando's right. I know. Any way you can pull that clon student again? Scramble the pilots' minds a little? There was a notable hesitation from the comm. I don't think so, Luke said at last. I don't think it's good for me to do that sort of thing. You understand? Han didn't really, but it probably didn't matter. For a moment he'd forgotten that he wasn't in the Falcon with a pair of quad lasers and shields and heavy armor. The Lady Luck, for all Lando's modifications, wasn't anything to take on even confused TIE fighter pilots with. All right, skip it, he told Luke. Sana just better be right about this help of hers. The words were hardly out of his mouth when a flash of brilliant green light shot past the Lady Luck's cockpit canopy. "TIE fighters coming in from port side," Lando snapped. "They're trying to cut us off," Luke said. "I'll get rid of them." Without waiting for command, he dropped his X-Wing below the Lady Luck's vector, and with a roar of main drive, swung off to the left toward the incoming TIE fighters. "Watch yourself," Han muttered after him, giving the rear scope another look. The pursuing batch of fighters was still closing fast. "Your ship got any weapons?" he asked Ironez. "No, but it's got good armor and plenty of deflector power," she told him. "Maybe you should get ahead of them, let them take the brunt of the attack." "Yeah, I'll think about it," Han said, wincing at the woman's ignorance of this kind of fight. TIE pilots didn't much care which ship was first in line when they attacked, and sitting close enough to another ship to hide it in its deflector shield was to give up your maneuverability. Off to port side, the incoming group of TIE fighters scattered out of the way as Luke drove through their formation, wingtip lasers blazing away madly. A second wave of Imperials behind the first closed to intercept as Luke pulled a hard 180 and swung back on the tails of the first wave. Han held his breath, but even as he watched, the X-Wing managed somehow to thread its way unscathed through the melee and take off at full throttle at an angle from the Lady Luck's vector, the whole squadron hot on his tail. "Well, so much for that group," Ironez commented. "And maybe for Luke, too," Lando countered harshly as he jabbed at the comm. "Luke, you alright?" "I got a little singe, but everything's still running," Luke's voice came back. "I don't think I can get back to you." "Don't try," Han told him. "As soon as you're clear, jump to light speed and get out of here." "What about you?" Luke's last word was partially drowned out by a sudden twitter from the comm. "That's the signal," Ironez said. "Here they come." Han frowned, searching the sky outside the front viewport. As far as he could see, there was nothing out there but stars. And then in perfect unison, 3 large ships suddenly dropped out of hyperspace into triangular formation directly ahead of them. Lando inhaled sharply. "Those are all dreadnought cruisers." "That's our help," Ironez said. "Straight down the middle of the triangle. They'll cover for us." "Right," Han gritted, shifting the Lady Luck's vector a few degrees, trying to coax a little more speed out of its engines. The New Republic had a fair number of dreadnoughts, and at 600 meters long each they were impressive enough warships, but even 3 of them working together would be hard-pressed to take out an Imperial Star Destroyer. Apparently the dreadnought's commander agreed. Even as the Star Destroyer behind the Lady Luck opened up with its huge turbolaser batteries, the dreadnoughts began pelting the larger ship with a furious barrage of ion cannon blasts, trying to temporarily knock out enough of its systems for them to get away. "That answer your question?" Han asked Luke. "I think so," Luke said dryly. "Okay, I'm gone. Where do I meet you?" "You don't," Han told him. He didn't like that answer much, and he suspected Luke would like it even less. But it couldn't be helped. With a dozen TIE fighters currently between the Lady Luck and the X-Wing, suggesting a rendezvous point on even what was supposed to be a secure comm channel would be an open invitation for the Empire to send their own reception committee on ahead. "Lando and I can handle the mission on our own," he added. "If we run into any problems, we'll contact you through Coruscant." "All right," Luke said. Sure enough, he didn't sound happy about it, but he had enough sense to recognize there was no other safe way. "Take care, you two." "See you," Han said, and cut the transmission. "So now it's my mission too, huh?" Lando growled from the co-pilot seat, his tone a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "I knew it. I just knew it." Sander's transport was into the triangular pocket between the dreadnoughts now, still driving for all it was worth. Han kept the Lady Luck with them, staying as close above the transport's tail as he could without getting into its exhaust. "You got some particular place you'd like us to drop you?" he asked, looking back at Ironez. She was gazing out the viewport at the underside of the dreadnought they were passing beneath. "Actually, our commander was rather hoping you'd accompany us back to our base," she said. Han threw a look at Lando. There had been something in her tone that implied the request was more than merely a suggestion. "And just how hard was your commander hoping this?" Lando asked. "Very much." She dropped her gaze from the dreadnought. "Don't misunderstand. It's not an order. But when I spoke to him, the commander seemed extremely interested in meeting again with Captain Solo." Han frowned. "Again?" Those were his words. Han looked at Lando, found the other looking back at him. "Some old friend you've never mentioned?" Lando asked. "I don't recall having any friends who own dreadnoughts," Han countered. "What do you think?" "I think I'm being nicely maneuvered into a corner here," Lando said, a little sourly. "Aside from that, whoever this commander is, he seems to be in contact with your boffin pals. If you're trying to find out what Failure's up to, he'd be the one to ask." Han thought it over. Lando was right, of course. On the other hand, the whole thing could just as easily be a trap, with this talk about old friends being designed to lure him in. Still, with Ironez sitting behind him with a blaster riding her hip, that wasn't really a graceful way to get out if she and Cena chose to press the point. They might as well be polite about it. "Okay," he told Ironez. "What course do we set?" "You don't," she said, nodding upward. Han followed her gaze. One of the 3 dreadnoughts they'd passed now swung around to fly parallel with them. Ahead, Cena's ship was heading up toward one of a pair of brightly lit docking ports. "Let me guess," he said to Ironez. "Just relax and let us do the flying," she said, for the first hint of humor that he'd yet seen from her. "Right," Han sighed. With the flashes of the rearguard battle still going on behind them, he eased the Lady Luck up toward the docking port. Luke, he reminded himself, had apparently not sensed any treachery from Sana or her people back in the city. But then he hadn't sensed any deceit from the Bims on Bimasari either, just before that first Norgrai attack. This time the kid better be right. The first dreadnought gave a flicker of pseudo-motion and vanished into hyperspace, taking the transport and the Lady Luck with it. A few seconds later, the other two dreadnoughts ceased their ion bombardment of the Star Destroyer and, through a hail of turbolaser blasts from still operating Imperial batteries, made their own escape. And Luke was alone, except of course for the squadron of TIE fighters still chasing him. From behind him came an impatient, rather worried-sounding trill. "Okay, R2, we're going," he assured the little droid. Reaching over, he pulled the hyperdrive lever, and the stars became star lines and turned to mottled sky, and he and R2 were safe. Luke took a deep breath, let it out in a sigh. So that was it. Han and Lando were gone, to wherever Sana and her mysterious commander had taken them, and there really wasn't any way for him to track them down. Till they surfaced again and got in touch with him, he was out of the mission. But perhaps that was for the best. There was another warble from behind, a questioning one this time. "No, we're not going back to Coruscant, R2, he told the droid, an echo of deja vu tugging at him. "We're going to a little place called Jomark, to see a Jedi Master." The little fast attack patrol ship had dropped out of hyperspace and close to within 100 kilometers of the Falcon before the ship's sensors even noticed its presence. By the time Leia got to the cockpit, the pilot had already made contact. "Is that you, Kabarak?" she called, slipping into the co-pilot seat beside Chewbacca. "Yes, Lady Vader," the Nograi's gravelly cat-like voice mewed. "I have come alone, as I promised. Are you also alone?" "My companion Chewbacca is with me as pilot," she said, "as is a protocol droid. I would like to bring the droid along to help with translation, if I may. Chewbacca, as we agreed, will stay here." The Wookiee turned to her with a growl. "No," she said firmly, remembering just in time to mute the transmitter. "I'm sorry, but that was the promise I made to Kabarak. You'll stay here on the Falcon, and that's an order." Chewbacca growled again, more insistently this time. And with a sudden prickly sensation on the back of her neck, Leia became acutely aware of something she hadn't really thought about for years. Namely, that the Wookiee was quite capable of ignoring pretty much any order he chose to. "I have to go alone, Chewie," she said in a lone voice. Force of will wasn't going to work here. She was going to have to go for logic and reason. "Don't you understand? That was the arrangement." Chewbacca rumbled. "No," Leia shook her head. "My safety isn't a matter of strength anymore. My only chance is to convince the Nograi that I can be trusted. That when I make promises, I keep them. The droid will pose no problem," Kabarak decided. "I will bring my ship alongside for docking." Leia switched the transmitter back on. "Fine," she said. "I also have one case of clothing and personal items to bring along, if I may. Plus a sensor/analyzer package to test the air and soil for anything that might be dangerous to me. The air and soil where we shall be is safe." "I believe you," Leia said, "but I'm not responsible only for my own safety. I carry within me 2 new lives, and I must protect them." The comm speaker hissed. "Heirs of the Lord Darth Vader?" Leia hesitated, but genetically, if not philosophically, it was true enough. "Yes." Another hiss. "You may bring what you wish," he said. "I must be allowed to scan them, though. Do you bring weapons?" "I have my lightsaber," Leia said. "Are there any animals on your world dangerous enough for me to need a blaster?" "Not anymore," Kabarak said, his voice grim. "Your lightsaber, too, will be acceptable." Chewbacca snarled something quietly vicious, his wickedly curved climbing claws sliding involuntarily in and out of their fingertip sheaths. He was, Leia realized abruptly, on the edge of losing control, perhaps of taking matters into those huge hands of his. "What is the problem?" Kabarak demanded. Leia's stomach tightened. "Honesty," she reminded herself. "My pilot doesn't like the idea of me going off alone with you," she conceded. "He has well, you wouldn't understand. He's under a life debt to you?" Leia blinked at the speaker. She hadn't expected Kabarak to have heard of the Wookiee life debt, much less know anything about it. "Yes," she said. "The original life debt was to my husband, Han Solo. During the war, Chewie extended it to include my brother and me. Now to the children you bear within you?" Leia looked at Chewbacca. "Yes." For a long minute the comm was silent. The patrol ship continued toward them, and Leia found herself gripping the seat arms tightly. She wondered what the Nograi was thinking. If he decided that Chewbacca's objections constituted betrayal of their arrangement, the Wookiee code of honor is similar to our own. Kabarak said at last, "He may come with you." Chewbacca gave a throaty rumble of surprise, a surprise that slid quickly into suspicion. "Would you rather he have said you had to stay here?" Leia countered, her own surprise at the Nograi's concession quickly covered up by relief, for the whole thing had been resolved so easily. "Come on, make up your mind." The Wookiee rumbled again. but it was clear that he'd rather walk into a trap with her than let her walk into one alone. "Thank you, Kabarak. We accept," Leia told the Nograi. "We'll be ready whenever you get here. How long will the trip to your world take, by the way?" "Approximately 4 days," Kabarak said. "I rate the honor of your presence aboard my ship." The con went silent. 4 days, Leia thought, a shiver running up her back. 4 days in which to learn all that she could about both Kabarak and the Nograi people, and to prepare for the most important diplomatic mission of her life. As it turned out, she didn't learn much about the Nograi culture during their trip. Kabarak kept largely to himself, splitting his time between the sealed cockpit and his cabin. Occasionally he would come by to talk to Leia, but the conversations were short and invariably left her with the uncomfortable feeling that he was still very ambivalent about his decision to bring her to his home. When they'd set up this meeting back on the Wookiee world of Kashyyyk, she had suggested that he discuss the question with friends or confidants, but as they neared the end of the voyage and his dark nervousness grew, she began to pick up little hints that he had not in fact done so. The decision had been made entirely on his own. It was not, to her way of thinking, a very auspicious beginning. It implied either a lack of trust in his friends or else a desire to absolve them from responsibility should the whole thing go sour. Either way, not exactly the sort of situation that filled her with confidence. With their host generally keeping to himself, she and Chewbacca were forced to come up with their own entertainment. For Chewbacca, with his innate mechanical interests, such entertainment consisted mainly of wandering through the ship and poking his nose into every room, access hatch and crawlway he could find, studying the ship, as he ominously put it, in case they needed at some point to fly it themselves. Leia, for her part, spent most of the trip in her cabin with 3PO, trying to deduce a possible derivation of Malariush, the only Nograi word she knew, with the hope of at least getting some idea of where in the galaxy they might be going. Unfortunately, with 6 million languages to draw on, 3PO could come up with any number of possible etymologies for the word, ranging from reasonable to tenuous to absurd and right back again. It was an interesting exercise in applied linguistics, but ultimately more frustrating than useful. In the middle of the 4th day, they reached the Nograi world, and it was even worse than she'd expected. "It's incredible," she breathed, a hard knot forming in her throat as she pressed close to Chewbacca to stare through the ship's only passenger viewport at the world they were rapidly approaching. Beneath the mottling of white clouds, the planetary surface seemed to be a uniform brown, relieved only by the occasional deep blue of lakes and small oceans. No greens or yellows, no light purples or blues. None of the colours, in fact, that usually signified planet life. For all she could tell, the entire planet might have been dead. Chewbacca growled a reminder. "Yes, I know Kabarak said it had been devastated in the war," she agreed soberly, "but I didn't realize he really meant the whole planet had been hit." She shook her head, feeling sick at heart, wondering which side had been most responsible for this disaster. Most responsible, she swallowed hard at the reflexively defensive words. There was no most responsible here, and she knew it. Kabarak's world had been destroyed during a battle in space, and there had been only 2 sides to the war. Whatever had happened to turn this world into a desert, the Rebel Alliance could not avoid its share of the guilt. "No wonder the Emperor and Vader were able to turn them against us," she murmured. "We have to find some way to help them." Chewbacca growled again, gestured out the viewport. The Terminator line was coming over the horizon now, a fuzzy strip of twilight between day and night, and there, fading through the darkness beyond, was what looked like an irregular patch of pale green. "I see it," Leia nodded. "You suppose that's all that's left?" The Wookiee shrugged, offered the obvious suggestion. "Yes, I suppose that would be the simplest way to find out," Leia agreed. "I really don't know if I want to ask him, though. Let's wait until we're closer and can see more of." She felt Chewbacca go stiff beside her a split second before his bellows split the air and left her ears ringing. "What?" And then she saw it, and her stomach nodded abruptly with shock. There, just coming over the curve of the planet, was an Imperial Star Destroyer. They'd been betrayed. "No," she breathed, staring out at the huge arrowhead shape. "No mistake. It was a Star Destroyer, all right. No, I can't believe Kabarak would do this." The lad's words were spoken to empty air, and with a sudden second shock, she realized that Chewbacca was no longer beside her. Spinning around, she saw a flash of brown as he vanished down the corridor leading to the cockpit. "No!" she shouted, pushing away from the bulkhead and taking off after him as fast as she could run. "Chewie, no!" The order was a waste of air, and she knew it. The Wookiee had murder in his heart, and he would get to Kabarak even if he had to tear down the cockpit door with his bare hands. The first clang sounded as she was halfway down the corridor. The second came as she rounded the slight curve and came within the sight of the door. Chewbacca was raising his massive fist for a third blow, when, to Leia's amazement, the door slid open. Chewbacca seemed surprised too, but he didn't dwell on it long. He was through the door before it was completely open, charging into the cockpit with an ululating Wookiee battle yell. "Chewie!" Leia shouted again, diving through herself, just in time to see Kabarak seated at the pilot station, throw up his right arm and somehow send Chewbacca spinning past him to crash with a roar into the underside of the control board. Leia skidded to a halt, not quite believing what she'd just seen. "Kabarak? I did not call them. the Nograi said, half turning to face her. "I did not betray my word of honor." Chewbacca funded his disbelief as he fought to scramble to his feet in the cramped space. "You must stop him," Kabarak shouted over the Wookiee's roar. "Must keep him quiet. I must give the recognition signal or all will be lost." Leia looked past him at the distant Star Destroyer, her teeth clenched hard together. Betrayal. But if Kabarak had planned a betrayal, why had he let Chewbacca come along? Whatever that fighting technique was he'd used to deflect Chewbacca's first mad rush, it wasn't likely to work a second time. She focused again on Kabarak's face, on those dark eyes, protruding jaw, and needle-sharp teeth. He was watching her, ignoring the threat of the enraged Wookiee behind him, his hand poised ready over the comm switch. A beep sounded from the board, and his hand twitched toward the switch before stopping again. The board beeped again. "I have not betrayed you, Lady Vader," Kabarak repeated, a note of urgency in his voice. "You must believe me." Leia braced herself. "Chewie, be quiet," she said. "Chewie, be quiet." The Wookiee ignored the order. Finally back on his feet, he roared his roar cry again and lunged for Kabarak's throat. The Nograi took the charge head on this time, grabbing Chewbacca's huge wrists in his wiry hands and holding on for all he was worth. It wasn't enough. Slowly but steadily, Kabarak's arms were bent steadily backwards as Chewbacca forced his way forward. "Chewie, I said stop." Leia tried again. "Use your head. If he was planning a trap, don't you think he'd have timed it for when we were asleep or something?" Chewbacca spit out a growl, his hands continuing their unwavering advance. "But if he doesn't check in, we'll know something's wrong," she countered. "That's a sure way to bring them down on us." "Lady Vader speaks truth," Kabarak said, his voice taut with the strain of holding back Chewbacca's hands. "I have not betrayed you, but if I give no recognition signal, you will be betrayed." "He's right," Leia said. "If they come to investigate, we lose by default. Come on, Chewie, it's our only hope." The Wookiee snarled again, shaking his head firmly. "Then you leave me no choice," Kabarak said. Without warning, the cockpit flashed of a blue light, dropping Chewbacca to the floor like a huge sack of grain. "What?" Leia gasped, dropping to her knees beside the motionless Wookiee. "Kabarak! A stun weapon only," the Nograi said, breathing rapidly as he swiveled back to his board. "A built-in defense." Leia twisted her head to glare at him, furious at what he'd done, a fury that faded reluctantly behind the logic of the situation. Chewbacca had been fully prepared to throttle the life out of Kabarak, and from personal experience she knew how hard it was to calm down an angry Wookiee, even when you were a friend to his friend to begin with. And Kabarak had tried talking first. "Now what?" she asked the Nograi, digging a hand through Chewbacca's thick torso hair to check his heartbeat. It was steady, which meant the stun weapon hadn't played any of its rare but potentially lethal tricks on the Wookiee's nervous system. "Now be silent," Kabarak said, tapping his comm switch and saying something in his own language. Another mewing Nograi voice replied, and for a few minutes they conversed together. Leia remained kneeling at Chewbacca's side, wishing she'd had time to bring 3PO up before the discussion started. It would have been nice to know what the conversation was all about. But finally it ended, and Kabarak signed off. "We are safe now," he said, slumping a little in his seat. "They are persuaded it was an equipment malfunction." "Let's hope so," Leia said. Kabarak looked at her, a strange expression on his nightmare face. "I have not betrayed you, Lady Vader," he said quietly, his voice hard and yet oddly pleading. "You must believe me. I have promised to defend you, and I will, to my own death, if need be." Leia stared at him, and whether through some sensitivity of the Force or merely her own long diplomatic experience, she finally understood the position Kabarak was now in. Whatever waverings or second thoughts he might have been facing during the voyage, the Star Destroyer's unexpected appearance had burned those uncertainties away. Kabarak's word of honor had been brought into question, and he was now in the position of having to conclusively prove that he had not broken that word, and he would have to go to whatever length such proof demanded, even if it killed him. Earlier, Leia had wondered how Kabarak could possibly understand the concept of the Wookiee life debt. Perhaps the Nograi and Wookiee cultures are more alike than she'd realized. "I believe you," she told him, climbing to her feet and sitting down in the co-pilot seat. Chewbacca she would have to leave where he was until he was awake enough to help her move him. "What now?" Kabarak turned back to his board. "Now we must make a decision," he said. "My intention had been to bring you to the ground in the city of Nystao, waiting until full dark to present you to my clan dynast. But that is now impossible. Our Imperial Lord has come, and is holding a convocate of the dynasts." The back of Leia's neck tingled. "Your Imperial Lord is the Grand Admiral?" she asked carefully. "Yes," Kabarak said. "That is his flagship, the Chimera. I remember the day that the Lord Darth Vader first brought him to us," he added, his moving voice becoming reflective. "The Lord Vader told us that his duties against the Emperor's enemies would now be taking his full attention, that the Grand Admiral would henceforth be our Lord and Commander." He made a strange, almost purring sound deep in his chest. There were many who were sad that day. The Lord Vader had been the only one, save the Emperor, who cared for Nograi well-being. He had given us hope and purpose. Leia grimaced, that purpose being to go off and die as death commandos at the Emperor's whim. But she couldn't say things like that to Kabarak. Not yet, anyway. Yes, she murmured. At her feet, Chewbacca twitched. He will be fully awake soon, Carbarak said. I would not like to stun him again. Can you control him? I think so, Leia said. They are coming in low toward the upper atmosphere now, on a course that would take them directly beneath the orbiting Star Destroyer. I hope they don't decide to do a sensor focus on us, she murmured. If they pick up free life forms here, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do. The ship's static damping should prevent this. Carbarak assured her. It is at full power. Leia frowned. Aren't they likely to wonder about that? No. I explained it was part of the same malfunction that caused the transmitter problem. There was a low rumble from Chewbacca, and Leia looked down to see the Wookiee's eyes glaring impotently up at her. Fully alert again, but without enough motor control yet to do anything. We've cleared out of control, she told him. We're heading down to... Where are we going, Carbarak? The Noghri took a deep breath, let out an odd sort of whistle. We will go to my home, a small village near the edge of the clean land. I will hide you there until our Lord the Grand Admiral leaves. Leia thought about that. A small village situated off the mainstream of Noghri life ought to be safely out of the way of wandering Imperials. On the other hand, if it was anything like the small villages she'd known, her presence there would be common knowledge an hour after they put down. Can you trust the other villagers to keep quiet? Do not worry, Carbarak said. I will keep you safe. But he hesitated before he said it, and as they headed into the atmosphere, Leia noted uneasily that he hadn't really answered the question. The dynast bowed one last time and stepped back to the line of those awaiting their turn to pay homage to their leader. Thrawn, seated in the gleaming high seat of the common room of Honogir, nodded gravely to the departing clan leader and motioned to the next. The other stepped forward, moving in the formalized dance that seemed to indicate respect, and bowed his forehead to the ground before the Grand Admiral. Standing 2 meters to Thrawn's right and a little behind him, Pellaeon shifted his weight imperceptibly between feet, stifled a yawn, and wondered when this ritual would be over. He'd been under the impression that had come to Honogir to try to inspire the commando teams, but so far the only Noghri they'd seen had been ceremonial guards and this small but excessively boring collection of clan leaders. Thrawn presumably had his reasons for waiting through the ritual, but Pellaeon wished it would hurry up and be over. With the galaxy still to win back for the Empire, sitting here listening to a group of grey-skinned aliens drone on about their loyalty seemed a ridiculous waste of time. There was a touch of air on the back of his neck. Captain? Someone said quietly in his ear. Lieutenant Setchel, he tentatively identified the voice. Excuse me, sir, but Grand Admiral Thrawn asked to be informed immediately if anything out of the ordinary happened. Pellaeon nodded slightly, glad of any interruption. What is it? It doesn't seem dangerous, or even very important, Setchel said. A Noghri commando ship is on its way and almost didn't give the recognition response in time. Equipment trouble, probably, Pellaeon said. That's what the pilot said, Setchel told him. The odd thing is that he begged off putting it down at the Nystyle landing area. You'd think that someone with equipment problems would want his ship looked at immediately. A bad transmitter isn't exactly a crisis-level problem, Pellaeon grunted. But Shell had a point, and Nystyle was the only place on Honogir with qualified spaceship repair facilities. We have an idea on the pilot? Yes, sir. His name's Carbarak, Clan Kimbar. I pulled up what we have on him, he added, offering Pellaeon a datapad. Surreptitiously, Pellaeon took it, wondering what he should do now. Thrawn had left instructions that he was to be notified of any unusual activity in the system, but to interrupt the ceremony for something so trivial didn't seem like a good idea. As usual, Thrawn was one step ahead of him. Lifting a hand, he stopped the Noghri clan dynast's presentation and turned his glowing red eyes to Pellaeon. You have something to report, Captain? A small anomaly only, sir, Pellaeon told him, steeling himself and stepping to the Grand Admiral's side. An incoming commando ship was slow to transmit its recognition signal and then declined to put down at the Nystyle landing area. Probably just an equipment problem. Probably, Thrawn agreed. Was the ship scanned for evidence of malfunction? Pellaeon checked the datapad. The scan was inconclusive, he told the other. The ship's static damping was strong enough to block. The incoming ship was static damped? Thrawn interrupted, looking sharply up at Pellaeon. Yes, sir. Wordlessly, Thrawn held up a hand. Pellaeon gave him the datapad, and for a moment the Grand Admiral frowned down at it, skimming the report. Carbarak, Clan Kimbar, he murmured to himself. Interesting. He looked up at Pellaeon again. Where did the ship go? Pellaeon looked in turn at Setchel. According to the last report, it was headed south, the lieutenant said. It might still be in range of our tractor beam, sir. Pellaeon turned back to Thrawn. Shall we try to stop it, Admiral? Thrawn looked down at the datapad, his face tight concentration. No, he said at last. Let it land, but track it. And order a tech team from the Chimera to meet us at the ship's final destination. His eyes searched for a line of Noghri dynasts, came to rest on one of them. Dynast Urkheim, Clan Kimbar, step forward. The Noghri did so. What is your wish, my lord? He mewed. One of your people has come home, Thrawn said. We go to his village to welcome him." Erkheim bowed, at my lord's request. Thrawn stood up. "Order for shuttle to be prepared, Captain," he told Palaon. "We leave at once." "Yes, sir," Palaon said, nodding the order onto Lieutenant Shell. "Wouldn't it be easier, sir, to have the ship and pilot brought here to us?" "Easier, perhaps," Thrawn acknowledged, "but possibly not as illuminating. You obviously didn't recognize the pilot's name, but Carbarak Clan Kimbar was once part of Commando Team 22. Does that jog any memories?" Palaon felt his stomach tighten. "That was the team that went after Leia Organa Solo on Kashyyyk, and of which team only Carbarak still survives," Thrawn nodded. "I think it might be instructive to hear from him the details of that failed mission, and to find out why it's taken him this long to return home." Thrawn's eyes glittered. "And to find out," he added quietly, "just why he's trying so hard to avoid us." It was full dark by the time Carbarak brought the ship to ground in his village, a tight-grouped cluster of huts with brightly lit windows. "Do ships land here often?" Leia asked as Carbarak pointed the ship toward a shadowy structure standing apart near the center of the village. In the glare of the landing lights, the shadow became a large cylindrical building with a flat cone-shaped roof. The circular wall composed of massive vertical wooden pillars, alternating with lighter shimmery wood. Just beneath the eaves, she caught a glint of a metal band encircling the entire building. "It is not common," Carbarak said, cutting the repulsor lifts and running the ship's systems down to standby. "Neither is it unheard of." In other words, it was probably going to attract a fair amount of attention. Chewbacca, who had recovered enough for Leia to help him into one of the co-pilot passenger seats, was obviously thinking along the same lines. "The villagers are all close family of the clan Kimbar," Carbarak said in answer to the Wookiee's slightly slurred question. "They will accept my promise of protection as their own. Come." Leia unstrapped and stood up, suppressing a grimace as she did so. But they were here now, and she could only hope that Carbarak's confidence was more than just the unfounded idealism of youth. She helped Chewbacca unstrap, and together they followed the Nograi back toward the main hatchway, collecting 3PO from her cabin on the way. "I must go first," Carbarak said as they reached the exit. "By custom, I must approach alone to the Dakar of the clan Kimbar upon arrival. By law, I am required to announce out-clan visitors to the head of my family." "I understand," Leia said, fighting back a fresh surge of uneasiness. She didn't like this business of Carbarak having conversations with his fellow Nograi that she wasn't in on. Once again, there wasn't a lot she could do about it. "We'll wait here until you come and get us." "I will be quick," Carbarak promised. He palmed the door release twice, slipping outside as the panel slid open and then shut again. Chewbacca growled something unintelligible under his breath. "He'll be back soon," Leia soothed him, making a guess as to what was bothering the Wookiee. "I'm certain he is telling the truth," 3PO added helpfully. "Customs and rituals of this sort are very common among the more socially primitive pre-spaceflight cultures." "Except for this culture isn't pre-spaceflight," Leia pointed out, her hand playing restlessly with the grip of her lightsaber as she stared at the closed hatchway in front of her. Carbarak could at least have left the door open so that they would be able to see when he was coming back. Unless, of course, he didn't want them to see when he was coming back. "That is evident, Your Highness," 3PO agreed, his voice taking on a professorial tone. "I feel certain, however, that their status in that regard has been changed during the recent..." "Well," he broke off as Chewbacca abruptly pushed past him and lumbered back toward the center of the ship. "Where are you going?" Leia called after the Wookiee. His only reply was some comment about the Imperials that she wasn't quite able to catch. "Chewie, get back here," she snapped. "Carbarak will be back any minute." This time the Wookiee didn't bother to answer. "Great," Leia muttered, trying to decide what to do. If Carbarak came back and found Chewbacca gone, but if he came back and found both of them gone... "As I was saying," 3PO went on, apparently deciding that the actions of rude Wookiees were better left ignored, "all the evidence I have gathered so far about this culture indicates that they were, until recently, a known spacefaring people. Carbarak's reference to the Dukar, obviously a clan center of some sort, the familial and clan structures themselves, plus this whole preoccupation with your perceived royal status. The High Court of Alderaan had a royal hierarchy too," Leia reminded him tartly, still looking back along the empty corridor. No, she decided, she and 3PO had better stay here and wait for Carbarak. Most other people in the galaxy didn't consider us to be socially primitive. "No, of course not," 3PO said, sounding a little embarrassed. "I didn't mean to imply any such thing." "I know," Leia assured him, a little embarrassed herself for jumping on 3PO like that. She'd known what he meant. "Where is he, anyway?" The question had been rhetorical, but even as she voiced it, the hatchway abruptly slid open. "Come," Carbarak said. His dark eyes flicked over Leia and 3PO. "Where is the Wookiee?" "He went back into the ship," Leia told him. "I don't know why. Do you want me to go and find him?" Carbarak made a sound halfway between a hiss and a purr. "There is no time," he said. "The matriarch is waiting. Come." Turning, he started back down the ramp. "Any idea how long it will take you to pick up the language?" Leia asked 3PO as they followed. I really cannot say, Your Highness, the droid answered as Karbrak led them across a dirt courtyard past the large wooden building they'd seen on landing. The Clan Dukar, Leia decided. One of the smaller structures beyond it seemed to be their goal. Learning an entirely new language would be difficult indeed, Freepio continued. However, if it is similar to any of the 6 million forms of communication with which I am familiar, I understand, Leia cut him off. They almost at a lighted building now, and as they approached, a pair of short Nograi standing in the shadows pulled open the double doors for them. Taking a deep breath, Leia followed Karbrak inside. From the amount of light coming through the windows, she would have expected the building's interior to be uncomfortably bright. To her surprise, the room they entered was actually darker than it had been immediately outside. A glance to the side showed why. The brightly lit windows were in fact standard self-powered lighting panels, with the operational sides facing outward. Except for a small amount of spillage from the panels, the interior of the building was lit only by a pair of floating wick lamps. Freepio's assessment of the society echoed through her mind. Apparently he'd known what he was talking about. In the center of the room, standing silently in a row facing her, were 5 Nograi. Leia swallowed hard, sensing somehow that the first words would be theirs. Karbrak stepped to the Nograi in the center and dropped to his knees, tucking his head to the floor and splaying out his hands to his sides. The same gesture of respect she remembered that he extended to her back in the Kashyyyk holding cell. "Lyosh mir lax forlai," he said. "Mir lai karasiv malariush vera vederush." "Can you understand it?" Leia murmured to Freepio. "To a degree," the droid replied. "It appears to be a dialect of the ancient trade language." "Shia!" The Nograi in the center of the line spat. Freepio recoiled. "She said quiet," he translated unnecessarily. "I understood the gist," Leia said, drawing herself up and bringing the full weight of her royal Alderaanian court upbringing to bear on the aliens facing her. Deference to local custom and authority was all well and good, but she was the daughter of their Lord Darth Vader, and there were certain discourtesies that such a person should not put up with. "Is this how you speak to the Malariush?" she demanded. 6 Nograi heads snapped over to look at her. Reaching out with the Force, Leia tried to read the sense behind those gazes, but as always, this particular alien mind seemed totally closed to her. She was going to have to play it by ear. "I asked a question," she said into the silence. The Nograi in the center took a step forward, and for the motion Leia noticed for the first time the 2 small, hard bumps on the alien's upper chest beneath the loose tunic. "A female? Matriarch," she murmured to Freepio, remembering the word Karbrak had used earlier. "A female who is leader of a local family or sub-clan structure," the droid translated, his voice nervous and almost too low to hear. Freepio hated being yelled at. "Thank you," Leia said. "I am the Nograi. You are the matriarch of this family?" "I am she," the Nograi said in heavily accented but understandable basic. "What proof do you offer to your claim of Mal-Ariush?" Silently, Leia held out her hand. The matriarch hesitated, then stepped up to her and gingerly sniffed it. "Is it not as I said?" Karbrak asked. "Be silent, third son," the matriarch said, raising her head to stare into Leia's eyes. "I greet you, Lady Vader, but I do not welcome you." Leia held her gaze steadily. She could still not sense anything from any of the aliens, but with her thoughts extended, she could tell that Chewbacca had left the ship and was approaching the house, approaching rather rapidly and with a definite agitation about him. She hoped he wouldn't charge brashly in and ruin what little civility remained here. "May I ask why not?" she asked the matriarch. "Did you serve the Emperor?" the other countered. "Or do you now serve our Lord, the Grand Admiral?" "No, to both questions," Leia told her. "Then you bring discord and poison among us," the matriarch concluded darkly. "Discord between what was and what now is." She shook her head. "We do not need more discord on Honogare, Lady Vader." The words were barely out of her mouth when the doors behind Leia swung open again and Chewbacca strode into the room. The matriarch stared at the side of the Wookiee. One of the other Nograi uttered something startled sounding, but any further reactions were cut off by Chewbacca's snarled warning. "Are you sure they're Imperials?" Leia asked, a cold fist clutching her heart. "No," she pleaded silently. "Not now. Not yet." The Wookiee growled the obvious, that a pair of Lambda-class shuttles coming from orbit and from the direction of the city of Nystau could hardly be anything else. Karbrak moved up beside the matriarch and said something urgently in his own language. "He says he has sworn protection to us," Freepio translated. "He asks that the pledge be honored." For a long moment, Leia thought the matriarch was going to refuse. Then with a sigh, she bowed her head slightly. "Come with me," Karbrak said to Leia, brushing past her and Chewbacca to the door. "The matriarch has agreed to hide you from our Lord the Grand Admiral, at least for now." "Where are we going?" Leia asked as they followed him out into the night. "Your droid and your analysis equipment I will hide among the decon droids that are stored for the night in an outer shed," the Nograi explained, pointing to a windowless building 50 meters away. "You and the Wookiee will be more of a problem. If the Imperials have sensor equipment with them, your life sign profiles will register as different from Nograi." I know, Leia said, searching the sky for the shuttle's running lights and trying to remember everything she could about lifeform identification algorithms. Heart rate was one of the parameters she knew, as was ambient atmosphere, respiratory byproducts, and molecule chain EM polarization effects. But the chief long-range parameter was, we need a heat source, she told Carbarak, as big a one as possible. The bakehouse, the Nograi said, pointing to a windowless building 3 down from where they stood. At its back was a squat chimney from which wisps of smoke could be seen, curling upward in the backwash of light from the surrounding structures. Sounds like our best chance, Leia agreed. Carbarak, you hide 3PO. Chewie, come with me. The Nograi were waiting for them as they stepped from the shuttle, 3 females standing side by side, with 2 children acting as honor wardens by the doors of the clan Dukar building. Thrawn glanced at the group, threw an evaluating sweep around the area, and then turned to Palaeon. Get them started on the check of the communications and countermeasures equipment in the ship over there. Then join me inside. Yes, sir. Thrawn turned to Baim. Dynast, he invited, gesturing at the waiting Nograi, but Dynast bowed and strode toward them. Thrawn threw a glance at Rook, who'd taken Urkheim's former position at the Grand Admiral's side, and together they followed. There was the usual welcoming ritual, and then the females led the way into the Dukar. The shuttle from the Chimera was only a couple of minutes behind them. Palaeon briefed the tech team and got them busy, then crossed to the Dukar and went in. He expected that the matriarch would have managed to round up perhaps a handful of her people for this impromptu late-evening visit by their glorious lord and master. To his surprise, he found that the old girl had in fact turned out half the village. There was a double row of them, children as well as adults, lining the Dukar walls from the huge genealogy wall chart back to the double doors and around again to the meditation booth opposite the chart. Thrawn was seated in the clan high seat 2/3 of the way to the back of the room, with Urkheim standing again at his side. The 3 females who'd met the shuttle stood facing them with a second tier of elders another pace back. Standing with the females, his steel-grey skin a marked contrast to their older, darker grey, was a young Nograi male. Palaeon had apparently missed nothing more important than a smattering of the nonsense ritual the Nograi never seemed to get enough of. As he moved past the silent lines of aliens to stand at Thrawn's other side, the young male stepped forward and knelt before the high seat. I greet you, my lord, he mewed gravely, spreading his arms out to his sides. You honor my family and the clan Kimbar with your presence here. You may rise, Thrawn told him. You are Carbarak, clan Kimbar. I am, your lord. You were once a member of the Imperial Nograi Commando Team 22, Thrawn said, a team that ceased to exist on the planet Kashyyyk. Tell me what happened. Carbarak might have twitched. Palaeon couldn't tell for sure. I filed a report, my lord, immediately upon leaving that world. Yes, I read the report, Thrawn told him coolly. Read it very carefully and noted the questions it left unanswered, such as how and why you survived when all the others in your team were killed, and how it was you were able to escape when the entire planet had been alerted to your presence, and why you did not return immediately to either Honogir or one of our other bases after your failure. This time there was definitely a twitch, possibly a reaction to the word failure. I was left unconscious by the Wookiees during the first attack, Carbarak said. I awakened alone and made my way back to the ship. Once there, I deduced what had happened to the rest of the team from official information sources. I suspect they simply were unprepared for the speed and stealth of my ship when I made my escape. As to my whereabouts afterward, my lord, he hesitated. I transmitted my report, and then left for a time to be alone. Why? To think, my lord, and to meditate. Wouldn't Honogir have been a more suitable place for such meditation? Thrawn asked, waving a hand round the Dukar. I had much to think about, my lord. For a moment Thrawn eyed him thoughtfully. He was slow to respond when the request for a recognition signal came from the surface, he said. You then refused to land at the Nystau port facilities. I did not refuse, my lord. I was never ordered to land there. For distinction is noted, Thrawn said dryly. Tell me why you chose to come here instead. I wish to speak with my matriarch, to discuss my meditations with her, to ask forgiveness for my failure. And have you done so? Thrawn asked, turning to face the matriarch. We have begun, she said in an atrociously mangled basic. We have not finished. At the back of the room, the Dukar doors swung open and one of the tech team stepped inside. You have a report, Ensign? Thrawn called to him. Yes, Admiral, the other said, crossing the room and stepping somewhat gingerly around the assembled group of Nograi elders. We finished our preliminary set of common countermeasures tests, sir, as per orders. Thrawn shifted his gaze to Carbarak. And? We think we've located the malfunction, sir. The main transmitter coil seems to have overloaded and backfired into a dump capacitor, damaging several nearby circuits. The compensator computer rebuilt the pathway, but the bypass was close enough to one of the static damping command lines for the resulting inductance surge to trigger it. An interesting set of coincidences, Thrawn said, his glowing eyes still on Carbarak. A natural malfunction, do you think, or an artificial one? The matriarch stirred, as if about to say something. Thrawn looked at her and she subsided. Impossible to say, sir, the tech said, choosing his words carefully. Obviously he hadn't missed the fact that this was skating him close to the edge of insult in the middle of a group of Nograi who might decide to take offense at it. Someone who knew what he was doing could probably have pulled it off. I have to say, though, sir, the compensated computers in general have a pretty low reputation among mechanics. They're okay on the really serious stuff. They can get unskilled pilots into big trouble, but on non-critical reroutes like this, they've always had a tendency to foul up something else along the way. Thank you. If Ron was annoyed that he hadn't caught Carbarak red-handed in a lie, it didn't show in his face. Your team will take the ship back to Nystau for repairs. Yes, sir. Patek saluted and left. Ron looked back at Carbarak. With your team destroyed, you will of course have to be reassigned, he said. When your ship has been repaired, you will fly to the Valra base in Glyph Sector and port there for duty. Yes, my lord, Carbarak said. Thrawn stood up. You have much to be proud of here, he said, inclining his head slightly to the matriarch. Your family service to the clan Kimbar and to the Empire will be long remembered by all of Honogare. As will your leadership and protection of the Nograi people, the matriarch responded. Flanked by Rook and Erkaim, Thrawn stepped down from the chair and headed back toward the double doors. Pleon took up the rear, and a minute later they were once again out in the chilly night air. The shuttle was standing readily, and without further comment or ritual, Thrawn led the way inside. As they lifted, Pleon caught just a glimpse out the viewport of the Nograi filing out of the Dukar to watch their departing leaders. Well, that was pleasant, he muttered under his breath. Thrawn looked at him. Waste of time, you think, Captain? He asked mildly. Pleon glanced at Erkaim, seated farther toward the front of the shuttle. The Dynast didn't seem to be listening to them, but it would probably still pay to be tactful. Diplomatically, sir, I'm sure it was worthwhile to demonstrate that you care about all of Honogare, including the outer villages, he told Thrawn. Given that the commandership really had malfunctioned, I don't think anything else was gained. Thrawn turned to stare out the side viewport. I'm not so sure of that, Captain, he said. There's something not quite right back there. Rook, what's your reading of our young commander Carbarak? He was unsettled, the bodyguard told him quietly. That much I saw in his hands and his face. Erkaim swiveled around in his chair. It is a naturally unsettling experience to face the Lord of the Nograi, he said. Particularly when one's hands are wet with failure, Rook countered. Erkaim half rose from his seat. For a pair of heartbeats, the air between the two Nograi was thick with tension. Pleon felt himself pressing back in his seat cushions, the long and bloody history of Nograi clan rivalry flooding fresh into his consciousness. This mission has generated several failures, Thrawn said calmly into the taut silence. In that, the clan Kimbar hardly stands alone. Slowly, Erkaim resumed his seat. Carbarak is still young, he said. He is indeed, Thrawn agreed. One reason, I presume, why he's such a bad liar. Rook, perhaps the Dynast Erkaim would enjoy the view from the forward section. Please escort him there. Yes, my lord. Rook stood up. Dynast Erkaim, he said, gesturing toward the forward blast door. For a moment the other Nograi didn't move. Then, with obvious reluctance, he stood up. My lord, he said stiffly, and headed down the aisle. Thrawn waited until the door had closed on both aliens, before turning back to Pleon. Carbarak is hiding something, Captain, he said, a cold fire in his eyes. I'm certain of it. Yes, sir, Pleon said, wondering how the Grand Admiral had come to that conclusion. Certainly the routine sensor scan they'd just run hadn't picked up anything. Shall I order a sensor focus on the village? That's not what I meant, Thrawn shook his head. He wouldn't have brought anything incriminating back to Honogare with him. You can't hide anything for long in one of those close-knit villages. No, something he's not telling us about that missing month. The one where he claims he was off meditating by himself. We might be able to learn something from his ship, Pleon suggested. Agreed, Thrawn nodded. Have a scanning crew go over it before the techs get to work. Every cubic millimeter of it, interior and exterior both. And have surveillance put someone on Carbarak. Yes, sir, Pleon said. One of our people or another Nograi? Thrawn cocked an eyebrow at him. The ridiculously obvious, or the heavily political, in other words, he asked dryly. Yes, you're right, of course. Let's try a third option. Does the Chimera carry any espionage droids? I don't believe so, Pleon said, punching up the question on the shuttle's computer link. No. We have some Arakid Viper probe droids, but nothing of the more compact espionage class. We'll have to improvise, Thrawn said. Have engineering put a Viper motivator into a decon droid and rig it with a full-range optical and auditory sensors and a recorder. We'll have it put in with the group working out of Carbarak's village. Yes, sir, Pleon said, keying in the order. Do you want a transmitter installed too? Thrawn shook his head. No, a recorder should be sufficient. The antenna would be difficult to conceal from view. The last thing we want is for some curious Nograi to see it and wonder why this one was different. Player nodded his understanding, especially since that might lead the aliens to start pulling decon droids apart for a look inside. Yes, sir. I'll have the order placed right away. Thrawn's glowing eyes shifted to look out the viewport. There's no particular rush here, he said thoughtfully. Not now. This is the calm before the storm. Captain, until the storm is ready to unleash, we might as well spend our time and energy making sure our illustrious Jedi Master will be willing to assist us when we want him. Which means bringing Leia Organa solo to him. Exactly. Thrawn looked at the forward blast door. And if my presence is what the Nograi need to inspire them, then my presence is what they'll have. For how long? Leon asked. Thrawn smiled tightly. For as long as it takes.